I stand at the edge of the water, where two worlds meet, where the land narrows and the sea whispers through a passage that has witnessed empires rise and fall like tides. The strait before me shimmers in light that seems to belong to no single hour, neither dawn nor dusk, but something eternal, something that exists outside the usual measure of days. The water moves in currents that have flowed for longer than memory, longer than any story written in stone or parchment, and on the far shore, barely a breath away across this narrow throat of sea, another continent waits in the golden haze. This is the place where Europe ends and Asia begins, or perhaps where Asia ends and Europe begins, for the answer changes depending on which shore you stand upon, which direction you face as the light changes and the gulls wheel overhead in their endless patterns. The city that grew here, in this impossible location, this place of convergence, knew many names across the centuries, but each name carried the same essential truth, that geography is destiny, and this geography was unlike any other on earth. 7 hills rise from the peninsula, just as 7 hills once cradled Rome. But these hills stand guard over something Rome never possessed, the gateway between 2 seas, the crossing point between 2 continents, the hinge upon which so much of human story would turn. I imagine standing here 2,000 years ago, when the hills were less crowded, when the cypress trees grew thicker on the slopes, and the settlements were smaller, scattered, not yet dreaming of what they would become. The fishing villages along these shores could not have known, could not have imagined, the weight of history that would settle upon this peninsula like west layers of sediment, each century adding its own stratum of memory and stone. The water itself tells stories. The Bosphorus, narrow and swift, connects the Black Sea to the north with the Sea of Marmara to the south, and beyond that, through another strait, the Aegean and the wider Mediterranean. These waters were highways before roads, connections before empires, and the currents here run deep and strange, flowing in different directions at different depths, surface water moving one way, while the deeper currents pull another, as if the sea itself cannot decide which way to go, caught between north and south, between the landlocked darkness of the Euxine and the open Mediterranean sun. And there is another water here, an inlet that curves into the peninsula like a horn, or like an arm reaching inland to embrace the hills. The Golden Horn, they called it, and the name feels right even now, for when the light catches it at certain angles, the water gleams with a warmth that seems almost metallic, almost precious. This natural harbor, deep and protected, offered anchorage to countless vessels across the ages. Phoenician traders and Greek triremes, Roman grain ships and medieval cogs, galleys flying banners in languages that have since fallen silent. The Greeks came early to these shores, settlers from Megara, looking for new lands, new harbors, new opportunities in a world that seemed infinite with possibility. They founded a colony here, gave it a name, built their temples and their walls, not knowing they were planting seeds that would grow into something far beyond their imagining. Their city was modest, practical, taking advantage of the natural defenses, the water on 3 sides, the hills providing elevation and vision, but the location, the location whispered promises that could not be ignored forever. I think of the generals and emperors who stood where I stand now, who looked across these waters and understood what this place could mean. The strait is so narrow here that you can see faces on the opposite shore when the light is clear, can watch the smoke rising from cooking fires, can almost hear voices carried across the water when the wind is right. To control this crossing, to command this passage, was to hold the throat of the world's trade, the pulse point of empire. Centuries rolled past like the tides. The Greek colony grew, persisted, endured invasions and sieges, rebuilt itself after fires and earthquakes. The hills gradually filled with structures, temples honoring gods whose names we still remember, Zeus and Poseidon, Apollo and Artemis. The harbor welcomed ships from distant ports, carrying grain and wine, olive oil and purple dye, timber from the Black Sea forests and amber from the Baltic shores. And then came a moment, a decision, a recognition of destiny that would change everything. An emperor, battle, weary and calculating, stood at a crossroads of his own. Rome, ancient Rome, the eternal city of 7 hills beside the Tiber, was no longer the center it had been. The empire had grown too vast, too unwieldy. Its frontiers stretched too thin across deserts and forests. The threats came from every direction now, and Rome, for all its glory, sat in the wrong place, too far west, too distant from the wealthy eastern provinces, too removed from the frontiers that needed constant defense. He needed a new capital, a new Rome, a place that could command the empire's resources, could watch over its most valuable territories, could project power in all the directions that mattered most. And so his eyes turned here, to this peninsula, this crossing, this place where the waters meet and the continents touch. Here, he saw, was the location that could anchor a new age. The decision, once made, set in motion transformations that would echo across 1,000 years. The transformation began in the year 324, when Constantine, the emperor who had reunited a fractured empire through force of arms and will, chose this ancient Greek settlement as the site for his new capital. He had considered other locations, Thessaloniki, Troy, even Jerusalem, but none possessed the strategic perfection of this peninsula. None commanded the waterways with such absolute authority. He arrived with architects and engineers, with priests and bureaucrats, with soldiers and laborers numbering in the tens of thousands. The modest city that had existed here, known as Byzantium for the centuries since its Greek founding, would be erased and reborn, expanded beyond anything its original settlers could have conceived. The emperor himself, according to the stories that survived, walked the boundaries of his new city, marking out walls that would encompass 7 hills in deliberate echo of Rome. He walked for miles, far beyond the existing settlement, and when his advisors questioned the enormous circuit he was tracing, he replied that he followed an invisible guide, a divine presence that showed him the true extent of what this place must become. Whether the story is true or legend hardly matters, for the ambition was real enough, and the construction that followed was staggering in its scope. Walls began to rise, massive fortifications of stone and brick, circuits within circuits, protecting a city that did not yet exist, but soon would. The old Greek Acropolis was incorporated into the new design, but everything expanded outward and upward, spreading across hills that were leveled and valleys that were filled. The natural topography was respected where it served the plan reshaped where it did not. The harbor of the Golden Horn became the commercial heart, its shores lined with warehouses and docks, quays built to handle the traffic of an empire. Across the peninsula, facing the Sea of Marmara, other harbors took shape, artificial basins carved and walled, creating protected anchorages for the imperial fleet, for the grain ships that would feed the growing population, for the merchant vessels that would make this city the crossroads of trade between east and west, north and south. Constantine demanded magnificence, and magnificence required spoliation. The empire was scoured for treasures to adorn the new capital. Columns were taken from temples in Athens and Ephesus. Statues were removed from their pedestals in Alexandria and Antioch. Obelisks that had stood in Egypt for millennia were transported across the sea, dragged up the hills, erected in the new forums and squares, the bronze horses of Chios, the serpent column from Delphi, the statue of Apollo from Phrygia. All were relocated. All became part of this manufactured glory. Churches rose on the hills, for Constantine had embraced Christianity, had seen in it the unifying force his empire needed. The Church of the Holy Apostles was built to house relics of the faith and eventually to serve as the emperor's own tomb. The first iteration of what would later become the great Hagia Sophia took shape, a basilica dedicated to holy wisdom, divine wisdom, though the building Constantine knew would not survive the centuries ahead. A hippodrome was constructed, vaster than any arena Rome possessed, seating capacity measured in the tens of thousands. Its central spine was decorated with the plundered monuments, the Egyptian obelisk, the serpent column, the masonry obelisk built from stone blocks and once covered in bronze plates. Here the citizens would gather, not just for chariot races, but for imperial ceremonies, for political demonstrations, for the communal expression of loyalty or discontent. The city was officially dedicated on the 11th of May. In the year 330, Constantine proclaimed it Nova Roma, New Rome, but the people had their own name for it, a name that honored the emperor who had created it from ambition and stone. They called it Constantinople, Constantine's city, and that name would endure for more than 1,000 years. The population grew with startling speed. Settlers were encouraged with grants of free grain, with land, with the promise of opportunity in this new center of power. Noble families from old Rome were persuaded to build palaces here, bringing their wealth and their influence. The Senate was duplicated, creating a second deliberative body to mirror the one in Rome, though both would gradually lose power to the imperial throne. Within a generation, Constantinople had become what Constantine intended, a true capital, perhaps more vital than Rome itself. The eastern provinces of the empire, wealthy Egypt and Syria, prosperous Asia Minor and Greece, now had their administrative center close at hand. The emperor could respond quickly to threats on the Persian frontier, could manage the Danube defenses with greater efficiency, could tap the wealth of the East without the delay of communicating across the Mediterranean. The location proved its worth again and again. When threats came from the north, from migrating peoples pushing against the Danube frontier, the city's position allowed rapid deployment of forces. When Persian armies invaded the eastern provinces, Constantinople served as the secure base from which countermeasures could be organized. The walls, already formidable, could be supplied by sea even if land routes were cut. The city could never be easily starved, never truly isolated as long as the navy controlled the waters. But the transformation was not merely strategic, it was cultural, spiritual. The city became the showcase for a new Christian empire. The old gods were not yet entirely forgotten. The classical traditions still commanded respect, but increasingly, the identity of Constantinople was bound up with the church, with Orthodox Christianity as it was developing in the Greek-speaking East. Councils were held here, bishops gathering to debate the nature of Christ, the relationship between Father and Son, the precise theological formulations that would define faith for millions. These debates were not abstract. They mattered intensely to emperors and citizens alike. Riots could erupt over doctrinal disputes. Factions formed around competing interpretations. The city's religious character shaped its politics, and its politics shaped the empire's religious direction. The 5th century brought challenges that tested everything Constantine had built. The Western Roman Empire, Old Rome and its territories, began its long collapse. Waves of migrating peoples, Goths and Vandals, Huns and Burgundians, carved kingdoms from what had been Roman provinces. The city of Rome itself was sacked, first in 410 by Visigoths, then again in 455 by Vandals. The unthinkable had happened. The eternal city had fallen, but Constantinople endured. Its walls held against attacks. Its position allowed it to survive where Rome could not. The emperors in Constantinople still called themselves Roman, still claimed authority over the lost western provinces, but increasingly they ruled only the East, Greece and Thrace, Asia Minor and the Levant, Egypt and parts of North Africa. This was still a formidable realm, wealthy and populous, but it was no longer the universal empire that Constantine had known. The Greek language, always dominant in the eastern provinces, became even more central to the imperial administration. Latin persisted in law and the military, in titles and official documents. But the everyday language of Constantinople was Greek, the language of its markets and monasteries, its schools and streets. The city was becoming something distinct, neither quite the new Rome that Constantine had proclaimed, nor simply a Greek city-state, but a synthesis, a civilization taking shape at the crossroads. The reign of Justinian, beginning in 527, marked both a pinnacle and a transformation. This emperor dreamed of reconquest, of restoring the empire to its former extent. His generals, Belisarius and Narses, led campaigns that reclaimed North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, parts of Spain from the Visigoths. For a brief moment, the Mediterranean seemed Roman again, the old empire seemingly restored, but Justinian's legacy to Constantinople itself was even more profound. In 532, riots erupted in the Hippodrome. Factions supporting the blue and green chariot racing teams turned their rivalry into armed rebellion. The Nika riots, named for the victory cry that united the factions, nearly toppled Justinian from his throne. Half the city burned, including the great church, the Hagia Sophia that Constantine had built. Justinian, persuaded by his Empress Theodora to stand firm rather than flee, crushed the rebellion with horrifying violence. Tens of thousands died in the Hippodrome, where imperial troops trapped the rioters. The city lay in ruins, devastated by fire and blood. And from those ruins, Justinian built something unprecedented. The new Hagia Sophia rose in just 5 years, a span of time that seems impossible given the ambition of what was created. Justinian assembled the finest architects, Anthemios of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, mathematicians as much as builders, men who understood geometry in ways that allowed them to conceive structures that defied conventional limits. The building they designed was unlike anything that had come before. Its central dome, spanning more than 100 feet across, seemed to float above the vast interior space with no visible means of support. Light poured in through windows ringing the dome's base, creating the illusion that the great hemisphere rested on a circle of light itself, on something immaterial and divine. The interior glowed with marble brought from quarries across the empire, green stone from Thessaly, purple porphyry from Egypt, white marble from the islands, yellow stone from Syria. The columns, salvaged from temples older than Christianity, supported galleries where empresses and noblewomen would observe the liturgy. The floor, patterned in geometric complexity, reflected the light from thousands of oil lamps and candles that burned during services. Gold covered the ceiling vaults, mosaic work that caught and multiplied the flickering light, creating an atmosphere that witnesses described as otherworldly, as if stepping from the streets of Constantinople into a realm that existed halfway between earth and heaven. When Justinian first entered the completed church, he is said to have whispered, "Solomon, I have surpassed you," comparing his creation to the legendary temple in Jerusalem. The building became the heart of the empire's spiritual life. Here emperors were crowned. Here the Patriarch of Constantinople led liturgies attended by thousands. Here the greatest occasions of state and faith unfolded beneath that impossible dome. The church represented everything Constantinople had become, a fusion of classical engineering and Christian devotion, a statement of permanence and divine favor, a monument that declared this city to be the center of the world. But the 6th century brought darkness along with glory. Plague arrived in 541, the first pandemic of what would later be called Justinian's plague, a disease that may have been bubonic, carried by rats and fleas from Egypt or beyond. It swept through the densely packed neighborhoods, through the tenements and palaces alike. Contemporary accounts describe wagons piled with corpses, mass graves dug outside the walls when the traditional burial grounds overflowed, towers filled with the dead when even the graves ran out. The population, which may have reached 500,000 at its peak, was decimated. The word is used precisely here, not merely reduced, but cut by ratios that left entire districts empty, entire professions without practitioners. The economic life of the city stumbled. Tax revenues collapsed. The ambitious building projects slowed or stopped entirely. Yet Constantinople survived, as it had survived riots and sieges, as it would survive challenges yet to come. The plague recurred in waves over the following centuries, but the city's position, its walls, its access to grain from Egypt and later from the Black Sea regions allowed it to endure where other cities might have collapsed entirely. The 7th century brought new threats, more existential than any before. The Persian Empire, revived under the Sassanid dynasty, launched devastating invasions into the eastern provinces. Jerusalem fell. The true cross was carried away to Persia. Egypt was conquered, the empire's wealthiest province lost. Persian armies reached the shores of the Bosphorus itself. camping within sight of Constantinople's walls. The city seemed on the verge of final catastrophe. Emperor Heraclius, desperate and determined, led an audacious campaign deep into Persian territory, turning defense into counterattack. His victories, won far from Constantinople in the mountains and valleys of Anatolia and beyond, destroyed the Sassanid military power, recovered the lost provinces, brought the true cross back to Jerusalem in triumph. For a moment, it seemed the empire had survived its greatest test, but even as Heraclius celebrated, a new force was rising in the deserts of Arabia. The followers of Muhammad, united by a new faith and driven by religious and imperial zeal, erupted from the peninsula. Syria fell to the Arab armies, then Palestine, then Egypt. Within a single generation, more than half the empire was lost, this time permanently. The wealthy provinces that had sustained Constantinople for centuries, that had fed its population and filled its treasuries, were gone. The empire contracted, becoming essentially a Greek kingdom centered on Constantinople and controlling Asia Minor, parts of Greece and the Balkans, scattered islands and coastal territories. The loss of Egypt was particularly devastating. Alexandria had been the empire's second city, and Egyptian grain had fed Constantinople's multitudes. New sources had to be found, new trade routes established, new agricultural regions developed in Thrace and around the Black Sea. The character of the empire changed. It became more thoroughly Greek in language and culture, more intensely focused on Orthodox Christianity as its defining identity. The elaborate bureaucracy adapted. The military reorganized into themes. Provincial districts where soldier farmers held land in exchange for military service. The classical heritage persisted in education and literature, but it was filtered increasingly through Christian interpretation, through monastic preservation, through a culture that saw itself as the guardian of true faith in a world threatened by heresies and infidels. Constantinople itself remained magnificent despite the reduced circumstances of the empire it governed. The walls, expanded and strengthened in the 5th century by the emperors Theodosius II, formed a triple line of fortifications across the landward approach, massive barriers studded with towers, fronted by a moat that could be flooded from cisterns within the city. No enemy could hope to breach these defenses with the siege technology of the age. The Arab caliphates tried repeatedly, sending armies and fleets to blockade the city by land and sea, but the walls held, and Greek fire, an incendiary weapon whose formula was a closely guarded secret, destroyed the Arab fleets in the waters around the city. The 8th and 9th centuries brought internal convulsions over theology. The iconoclast controversy erupted when emperors, influenced by concerns that the veneration of religious images bordered on idolatry, ordered the destruction of icons throughout the empire. Mosaics were covered with plaster, paintings destroyed, statues broken. The dispute raged for more than a century, tearing the church and the empire into factions, pitting emperors against patriarchs, monks against soldiers, east against west. Constantinople became a battleground of theology. Monasteries that refused to surrender their icons were persecuted. Defenders of images were exiled, or worse. But the iconophile position, the defense of sacred images, eventually prevailed. The triumph of orthodoxy in 843 restored the icons, and restored also a sense of unity to the empire's religious life. The controversy had pushed the empire further from the Latin West, where the Pope had condemned iconoclasm. deepening divisions that would eventually become an unbridgeable schism. Through all these centuries, the physical city continued to evolve. Aqueducts brought water from distant sources, feeding enormous underground cisterns, vast chambers supported by forests of columns, where water reserves enough to survive long sieges accumulated in cool darkness. The basilica cistern, with its hundreds of columns salvaged from classical buildings, its Medusa head column bases lying sideways in the water, was only the largest of many such constructions. The imperial palace complex sprawled across the southeastern point of the peninsula, a city within the city, halls and churches, barracks and treasuries, throne rooms decorated with mechanical wonders that impressed foreign ambassadors, golden trees where mechanical birds sang, thrones that could be raised toward the ceiling by hidden machinery, all designed to demonstrate the emperor's power and the empire's sophistication. The markets hummed with commerce from a world that extended far beyond the empire's shrunken borders. Silk from China arrived via the overland routes, furs from the north, amber and slaves from beyond the Black Sea, spices from India and the islands beyond. The city's artisans were renowned for their skill. Silk weaving had been introduced in Justinian's time, when monks smuggled silkworm eggs from China, breaking the Asian monopoly. Constantinople's silk became a luxury export, controlled by imperial monopoly, distributed as diplomatic gifts that carried prestige and obligation. The countryside around the city, across the waters in Asia, and around the coasts, was dotted with estates and monasteries, vineyards and olive groves, fishing villages that supplied the city's markets. In summer, the wealthy retreated to palaces along the Bosphorus shores, where sea breezes cooled the marble halls, where gardens descended in terraces to private harbors. The 10th and 11th centuries marked a resurgence, a period when the empire regained strength and Constantinople shone with renewed brilliance. Emperor Basil II, who reigned from 976 to 1025, expanded the frontiers through relentless campaigning. Bulgaria was conquered after decades of warfare. The Balkans brought securely under imperial control. Regions in the east were reclaimed from Arab emirs. The empire's borders reached extents not seen since before the Arab conquests, and wealth flowed once more into Constantinople's treasuries. The city became a destination for travelers from all directions. Merchants from Venice and Genoa established quarters along the Golden Horn. Russian traders brought furs and amber from the northern forests. Pilgrims passed through on their way to Jerusalem, stopping to marvel at the relics preserved in Constantinople's churches, the crown of thorns, fragments of the true cross, enough holy remains to fill entire catalogs. Visitors recorded their astonishment at the city's splendor. The Russian envoys sent by Prince Vladimir of Kiev in the late 10th century returned with tales of divine services in Hagia Sophia so magnificent they could not tell whether they were in heaven or on earth. Their report influenced Vladimir's decision to adopt Orthodox Christianity, binding Rus to Constantinople's religious and cultural sphere, creating connections that would shape Eastern Europe for centuries. But prosperity brought complacency, and the empire's military strength began to erode. The themes, those districts of soldier farmers, were gradually replaced by professional troops, mercenaries who fought for pay rather than land. The great landowning families accumulated power, building estates that rivaled imperial holdings. The delicate balance between emperor and aristocracy, between central authority and provincial magnates, began to tilt. In 1054, the simmering tensions between the Orthodox East and Catholic West finally erupted into formal schism. Disputes over theology, over the authority of the Pope versus the Patriarch, over the precise wording of the Creed, led to mutual excommunications. The Christian world split definitively. Rome and Constantinople, once united under a single empire, now represented separate and competing traditions. The break was partly theological, partly political, partly cultural, a recognition that East and West had been drifting apart for centuries, and the final severance merely acknowledged reality. 17 years later, disaster struck from an unexpected direction. The Seljuk Turks, nomadic warriors who had converted to Islam and carved out a sultanate in Persia, invaded Asia Minor at Manzikert in 1071. They destroyed a Byzantine army and captured the Emperor Romanos IV. The defeat was catastrophic, not merely for the loss of troops, but for what followed. Asia Minor, the heartland that had sustained the empire since the loss of Egypt and Syria, dissolved into chaos. Turkish warbands raided at will. Local strongmen declared independence. Within a decade, most of Anatolia was lost. Constantinople itself was not directly threatened. The walls still stood impregnable, but the empire's strategic position had fundamentally weakened. The city that had once commanded provinces from the Atlantic to Mesopotamia now controlled little beyond Thrace, parts of Greece, and scattered coastal territories. The population of the capital itself may have declined to fewer than half the number who had lived there in Justinian's day. The emperors turned to the west for help. Emperor Alexios I, facing Turkish pressure and Norman aggression in the Balkans, sent appeals to the Pope, asking for mercenary troops to help recover lost territories. The response exceeded anything he had imagined or desired. In 1096, Pope Urban II preached the First Crusade, calling on Western knights to march to Jerusalem's rescue, to win back the Holy Land from Muslim rule. The Crusaders who arrived in Constantinople were unlike any allies the empire had dealt with before. Frankish knights, Norman adventurers, German nobles, they came in their tens of thousands, armored and hungry, pious and greedy in equal measure. Alexios managed to extract oaths of loyalty, promises to return conquered lands to imperial control. But the cultural gulf between the Greeks of Constantinople and these Latin warriors was vast, mutual incomprehension shading into mutual contempt. The Crusades brought temporary benefits. Some lost territories were recovered. Buffer states were established in Syria and Palestine, but they also brought complications that would prove disastrous. Italian city-states, Venice and Genoa especially, demanded trading privileges in exchange for naval support. Their merchant quarters in Constantinople grew into autonomous colonies, controlling larger shares of the city's commerce, undermining the empire's economic independence. The wealth remained visible. The palaces still gleamed with marble and mosaic. The churches still held their treasures. The markets still offered luxuries from across the known world. But the underlying strength was ebbing. The empire was being hollowed out, its provinces lost or alienated, its military power dependent on mercenaries, its economy increasingly dominated by foreign merchants. The 12th century saw Constantinople at its most cosmopolitan and most vulnerable. The city's population was a mixture of Greeks and Armenians, Slavs and Italians, Jews and Arabs, speaking a cacophony of languages, following different rites and customs. The Venetian quarter alone housed thousands of Latin merchants with their own churches and laws. The Genoese had their enclave, Pisans another. Each Italian city competed for imperial favor, for better terms, for greater privileges. Emperor Manuel I, reigning from 1143 to 1180, tried to restore imperial prestige through grand gestures. He campaigned in Italy, negotiated with the Pope about reuniting the churches, held tournaments in Western style to impress visiting crusaders. His court was magnificent, but the displays masked continuing decline. When he died, the empire fragmented into factions, civil wars, coups and counter-coups that weakened central authority. In 1182, riots erupted against the Latin merchants, resentment at their wealth and privileges, at their control of commerce, at their arrogance, boiled over into violence. The Venetian and Genoese quarters were attacked, merchants were killed, properties looted. The massacre poisoned relations with the Italian states, created enmities that would soon bear bitter fruit. The Fourth Crusade was supposed to march to Egypt, to strike at Muslim power at its source. Instead, diverted by Venetian interests and Byzantine dynastic disputes, the Crusader army arrived at Constantinople in 1203. They came ostensibly to restore a deposed emperor, but when the political situation in the city grew complicated, when promised payments were not delivered, the Crusaders turned on Constantinople itself. In April of 1204, Western Christian warriors stormed the walls of the greatest Christian city in the world. What followed was catastrophe beyond measure. For 3 days, the Crusaders sacked Constantinople. Churches were stripped of their treasures, icons pried from walls, relics scattered or stolen. The bronze horses of the Hippodrome were taken to Venice, where they still stand. Libraries burned. Manuscripts that preserved classical texts were lost forever. Women were violated. Citizens killed regardless of age. The city that had stood unconquered for 9 centuries, that had repelled countless sieges by enemies of every description, fell to an army that marched under Christian banners. The Crusaders established a Latin empire in Constantinople, parceling out the Byzantine territories among Frankish nobles. The great city became a shabby imitation of itself, stripped of wealth, depopulated, its glory vandalized. The Venetians took the best relics and treasures back to Italy, the finest horses, the most precious manuscripts, the holiest relics, all disappeared into Western collections. Byzantine remnants survived in exile, Greek emperors ruling from Nicaea in Asia Minor, from Trebizond on the Black Sea coast, preserving the tradition, keeping alive the claim to legitimate rule for 57 years. Constantinople languished under Latin occupation. Its population declined, its monuments crumbled, its role as a center of civilization diminished. In 1261, Michael VIII Palaeologos, ruling from Nicaea, recaptured Constantinople through a combination of diplomacy and opportunistic assault. The Latin garrison was undermined, the defenses weak, and the city returned to Greek rule, but what was recovered was a shadow. The empire that resumed was impoverished, controlling little territory, facing threats from all sides. The Ottomans, a Turkish people who had established themselves in northwestern Anatolia, were beginning their expansion, taking Byzantine cities one by one, gradually encircling what remained. Constantinople was restored as best the limited resources allowed. Churches were repaired, the palace complex partially rebuilt, intellectual life revived as scholars gathered once more in the ancient capital. The 14th century saw a flowering of art and theology, of philosophical debate and literary production, a final renaissance of Byzantine culture, even as the empire's political and military situation deteriorated beyond recovery. The city's population continued to shrink. Perhaps 40,000 lived within walls built to shelter 500,000. Whole districts lay abandoned. Fields and vineyards grew within the ancient circuits. The great forums were quiet, the hippodrome unused. The emperors could barely afford to maintain the essential fortifications, let alone restore the city to its former magnificence. Yet Constantinople remained a symbol. The emperors, however weak, still carried the prestige of Roman legitimacy, still claimed descent from Augustus and Constantine. The patriarch still led the Orthodox Church, still commanded spiritual allegiance across Eastern Europe and beyond. The city's libraries, though diminished, still preserved texts unknown in the West. Byzantine scholars would carry this learning to Italy, contributing to the Renaissance that was beginning to stir. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, barely into his 20s but possessed of an ambition that matched the city he desired, assembled an army of unprecedented size in the spring of 1453, perhaps 80,000 soldiers, perhaps more. The chronicles disagree on numbers but concur on the overwhelming disparity. Constantinople could muster fewer than 7,000 defenders, citizens and foreign volunteers, Genoese and Venetian sailors, a handful of knights against a force that surrounded the land walls like a tide. The siege began in early April. The Ottomans brought technology that previous besiegers had lacked. Massive cannon, cast specially for this assault, fired stone balls weighing over 1/2 ton. The walls that had stood for 1,000 years, that had turned back every assault, now shuddered under bombardment of unprecedented intensity. Day after day, the great guns roared, slowly battering breaches in the ancient fortifications. The defenders worked through the nights, repairing breaches with timber and rubble, anything to plug the gaps. The Emperor Constantine XI, last of the Roman emperors, fought alongside his men, refusing offers of escape, choosing to die with his city, if die it must. The patriarch led prayers in Hagia Sophia. The great church filled night after night with liturgies for deliverance that would not come. On the 29th of May, after nearly 2 months of siege, the final assault began before dawn. Wave after wave of Ottoman troops threw themselves at the walls. The defenders, exhausted and depleted, held through the initial attacks, but the relentless pressure found weaknesses. A small gate, the Kirkaporta, had been left unlocked. A handful of Ottoman soldiers found it, got inside the walls, raised their banners on the ramparts. The sight of enemy flags inside the defenses broke the defense. Sections of wall were abandoned. Defenders fled or were overwhelmed. The Ottomans poured through breaches and over walls, flooding into streets they had dreamed of conquering. Constantine XI died fighting, his body lost among the thousands of dead. Whether he fell on the walls or in the streets, no one could say with certainty. The sack that followed was thorough but organized. Mehmed had promised his troops the customary 3 days of plunder, and the soldiers took what they wanted, But the Sultan also moved quickly to establish order, to preserve what he intended to make his own capital. Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque, the crosses removed, minarets eventually added, but the great building itself was preserved, its mosaics plastered over rather than destroyed. The name began to change gradually at first. The city had been Istanbul, in common Turkish speech even before the conquest, a corruption of the Greek phrase Eistinpolin, meaning to the city. After 1453, this informal name became official, though Constantinople persisted in Western usage for centuries. The transformation was not merely nominal. The Ottoman Empire made Istanbul its capital, pouring resources into restoration and expansion, bringing in Muslim settlers while allowing Greek and Armenian Christians to remain, creating a new cosmopolitan mixture, the dome of Hagia Sophia, which had survived earthquake and fire, iconoclasm, and crusader sack, now echoed with calls to prayer instead of Byzantine chant. The building that Justinian had built, that had been the heart of Orthodox Christianity for 9 centuries, became the model for Ottoman imperial mosques. Its dome inspired the architects of the Blue Mosque and the Suleimani, ensuring that Justinian's architectural vision continued to shape the city's skyline even under new rulers. Something profound shifts when we contemplate the span of time contained within this place. More than 2,000 years from the first Greek settlement to the Ottoman conquest, and another 500 years beyond that to our present moment. The layers accumulate, each civilization building upon or beside the ruins of what came before, each leaving traces that persist into our contemporary world. The city's geography remains unchanged. The Bosphorus still flows between Europe and Asia, still carries ships between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The Golden Horn still curves into the peninsula, though its shores are lined now with bridges and highways rather than Byzantine warehouses. The 7 hills still rise, though the silhouette is different. Minarets where there were once bell towers, modern towers alongside Ottoman domes. Beneath the streets, the cisterns still hold water in their shadowed chambers. Tourists descend into the Basilica cistern, walk on platforms above the shallow pools. See the Medusa heads at the base of columns. Try to imagine the Byzantine engineers who created this space, who calculated the arches and the water flow, who salvaged those classical columns from buildings already ancient in their time. The walls still stand, or sections of them do, stretching across the modern city, interrupting traffic patterns, preserved as monuments to what they once protected. You can walk along portions of the Theodosian walls, touch stone laid 1,500 years ago, see where Ottoman cannonballs struck, where breaches were repaired, where history moved from potential to actual in moments of violence and decision. Hagia Sophia endures, though its purpose has shifted again, no longer mosque but museum, and now once more a mosque while remaining open to visitors. The building has outlasted empires, has served 3 religions, if we count its brief period as a Catholic cathedral during the Latin occupation. The dome still seems to float, still creates that sense of space transcending normal architectural limits. Justinian's boast was not empty. He did create something that has surpassed most human constructions in longevity and influence. The continuity is what strikes most deeply. This was not a city that rose and fell and was forgotten, buried under sand or reclaimed by jungle. It persisted, adapted, survived transformation after transformation while maintaining some essential character. Some thread connects the Greek colonists and the Byzantine emperors, the Ottoman sultans, and the modern citizens of Istanbul. All were shaped by this geography, this strategic position, this place where waters meet and continents almost touch. To study Constantinople is to study the entire sweep of Mediterranean and Near Eastern history. Every major power touched this city: Greeks and Romans, Persians and Arabs, Bulgars and Russians, Crusaders and Ottomans. Each left marks, contributed to the accumulation of culture and conflict that made the city what it was, what it is. The question of identity becomes complex here. Was it a Greek city, a Roman capital, a Christian citadel, an Ottoman metropolis? The answer shifts depending on the century. But perhaps the real answer is that it was all of these, that places with such long histories contain multitudes, hold contradictions without resolving them into simple narratives. Night falls over the water, and the city lights reflect in the Bosphorus, ships still passing through the strait as they have for millennia, though now they carry containers and oil rather than grain and silk. The minarets are illuminated. The bridges span the water in swooping arcs of steel and light. Ferries cross between continents in minutes, carrying commuters who barely register the strangeness of their daily transit between Europe and Asia. Somewhere beneath the modern streets, Byzantine mosaics wait undiscovered. Ottoman archives preserve documents and scripts few can now read. The layers go down and down, each excavation revealing earlier foundations, classical temples beneath Byzantine churches, beneath Ottoman mosques, beneath modern buildings. The archaeology of this place could continue for centuries and still not exhaust what lies buried. The name Istanbul has prevailed. Constantinople exists now mainly in history books and poetry, in the stories of what was and what passed away. But names are surface, and the place beneath the name persists, changes, and yet remains. The water still flows, the hills still rise, the strategic position still matters, even if modern geopolitics has shifted the calculus of power. I think of all who stood where I stand, who watched ships pass through this strait, who climbed these hills, who prayed in buildings now ruined or transformed. The continuity of place connects them across centuries that divide everything else. Constantine and Justinian, Mehmed and Suleiman, emperors and sultans, merchants and monks, soldiers and scholars, all knew these same waters, felt these same winds off the sea. The story does not end, cannot end, because the place continues. The city that was Byzantium and Constantinople, that became Istanbul and remains Istanbul, still exists at the crossroads, still watches over the water, still accumulates history with each passing year. The layers deepen, the complexity increases, and somewhere in that accumulation, in that refusal to be reduced to a single narrative, lies something essential about human civilization itself. How we build, how we endure, how we transform and yet carry forward elements of what we were. The city shows us this in stone and water, in walls that stand and domes that shelter prayers, in languages the builders never imagined, in streets walked by pilgrims and tourists, conquerors and exiles, in the endless flow of the Bosphorus connecting seas and epochs. The light fades now over the water, and the details blur into silhouette. The specifics of dynasty and doctrine, of siege and treaty, of rise and fall, all settle into the larger pattern, a place at the edge, a threshold, a crossing point where the world meets itself, where East encounters West, where Europe touches Asia, where past flows into present like the current flows from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. And in the gathering darkness, as the city lights brighten against the night, the sense of duration becomes almost palpable. 2,000 years, 50 generations, 100 emperors and sultans, countless millions who lived and died within these walls or passed through on their way to somewhere else, all of it compressed into this geography, this peninsula, this crossing, this place that has witnessed more of human story than perhaps any other spot on earth. The water keeps moving, patient and persistent, wearing at stone, reflecting light, connecting distant shores. It was here before the first settlements, and it will remain long after our current moment becomes another layer in the endless accumulation. The city changes, the empires rise and fall, but the strait continues. The crossing endures. The place persists. I think about paper sometimes, not the bright white sheets that come from printers or the pages of mass-produced books, but the idea of paper itself, the notion that human beings, across centuries and continents, found ways to capture thought, to hold language, to preserve what mattered most. There's something almost miraculous in it, this transformation of plant fiber into surface, of organic matter into canvas for the mind. And when I let my thoughts wander back through time, I find myself standing at the edge of the Nile, where the water moves slowly, thick with silt, and the reeds grow tall in the shallows. The papyrus plants rise from the riverbank, their triangular stems reaching upward, swaying slightly, and I watch as practiced hands, cut the stalks near the base, selecting the tallest ones, the strongest, bringing them to shore where the work begins. The outer rind peels away easily, revealing the pale pith inside, and this inner core, fibrous and damp, holds everything. This is where the magic lives, in the cellular structure of a marsh plant, in the natural adhesives locked inside its tissues. Someone slices the pith into thin strips, laying them side by side on a flat stone, each strip pressed against the next, forming a horizontal layer, and then another layer crosses over it perpendicular, creating a woven pattern without any weaving, just plant against plant, fiber against fiber. And here's where understanding deepens, because papyrus doesn't need glue, the plant's own sugars, its natural resins. They seep out under pressure, binding the layers together as the water evaporates, as the strips dry slowly in the Egyptian sun. Days of drying, days of waiting, while the fibers interlock and the surface becomes smooth. I imagine running my hands across that finished sheet, feeling the slight texture, the parallel lines where the strips meet, and there's a warmth to it, a subtle variation in color, cream and ivory and pale gold, because this is organic. This is river plant, turned into something that will outlast empires. The smell must have been earthy, vegetal, like wet grass drying in summer heat. And perhaps there was a faint sweetness too, from those natural sugars activating, binding, creating something new from something that grew. Scribes would prepare their surfaces carefully, burnishing the papyrus with smooth stones, polishing it until the fibers lay flat and even until the surface could accept ink without bleeding, without the characters spreading and blurring into illegibility. And they wrote, century after century, in hieratic script and demotic, recording temple inventories and love poems, legal contracts and sacred hymns, each stroke of the reed brush landing on a surface that came from the delta, from the marshlands where ibises waded and lotus flowers opened at dawn. But papyrus had its limitations, its geography. It grew where the Nile flooded, where the water table stayed high. It was a gift of that particular ecosystem, and beyond Egypt's borders, beyond the Mediterranean coasts where papyrus could be traded, other minds were solving the same problem differently, across deserts and mountain ranges, in the river valleys of another ancient world. Hands were stripping bark from mulberry trees, from the paper mulberry, the kozo, and discovering that beneath the rough outer bark lay something softer, a bast fiber, pale and surprisingly strong. The inner bark came away in long strips, and when soaked in water, when beaten and pulped, the fibers began to separate, to break down into something almost cloud-like, a suspension of cellulose in water. And this was the moment of transformation, because unlike papyrus, which stayed whole, these fibers were disintegrating, becoming individual threads floating in liquid. I think of those early paper makers watching the water turn milky with fiber, understanding somehow, through observation and experiment, that they could capture this suspension, lift it, strain it through a screen. The screen itself, bamboo strips bound together, or cloth stretched over a wooden frame, dipped into the vat, and as it lifted, as the water drained away, the fibers caught on the screen's surface, interlacing, forming a mat, a web of cellulose that would dry into something entirely new. This wasn't strips laid side by side. This was fiber bonded to fiber at the molecular level. Hydrogen bonds forming between cellulose chains, creating a sheet that was uniform, strong, flexible in ways that papyrus could never be. And the texture, I imagine it was softer, more consistent, without those visible strips, just a gentle surface that took ink beautifully, that could be folded without cracking, that could travel without shattering into fragments. The knowledge of paper making, this understanding of how to transform plant fiber into writing surface, it didn't spread quickly, not in the way information moves now. Instead, it traveled along trade routes, carried by those who had seen the process, who understood the subtle chemistry of fiber and water. In China, where this technique first emerged, perhaps as early as the 2nd century, or even before, the methods were guarded, valued, because paper represented something revolutionary, a surface cheaper than silk, more flexible than bamboo strips, lighter than the wooden tablets that scholars had used for generations. I think of a Kailun, whose name appears in the historical record around the year 105, a court official during the Han Dynasty. And whether he invented paper or simply improved and standardized existing techniques, his legacy became intertwined with this material, with the idea that tree bark and hemp, old fishing nets and rags, could be transformed into something precious. The process he refined, or perhaps documented, began with collection, gathering the raw materials, the inner bark of mulberry trees. Yes, but also hemp fibers, remnants of cloth too worn for other purposes, and these materials were sorted, examined, chosen for their fiber length and strength. Then came the soaking, immersing everything in water, letting it soften, days of softening, until the fibers began to separate, and then the beating, rhythmic and constant, using wooden mallets or stones, pounding the wet fibers against flat surfaces, breaking down the cellular structure, releasing the individual threads of cellulose. The sound of it, that repetitive thudding, it must have echoed through workshops, a meditation in percussion, and slowly, gradually, the mass transformed into pulp, into a substance that was neither quite solid nor quite liquid, something in between. And here's where the art revealed itself, because the quality of paper depended on this stage, on how thoroughly the fibers were beaten, how evenly they were distributed. Too little beating, and the fibers wouldn't bond; too much, and they would become too short, too weak. The papermaker developed a feel for it, knowing by touch and sight when the pulp was ready, when it had reached that perfect consistency, and then it went into the vat, diluted with more water, stirred gently, creating a suspension where thousands of tiny fibers floated, waiting. The mold came next, and this tool, this simple frame with its screen surface, it held everything, the future of the sheet. The papermaker dipped it into the vat, submerging it completely, then lifted it horizontally, slowly, watching as the water drained through the screen, as the fibers settled onto the surface. And there was a technique to it, a slight shake, a gentle back and forth motion that helped the fibers interlock, that created a uniform distribution across the screen, because without this movement, the paper would be thick in some places, thin in others, weak and uneven. The water dripped away, and what remained was a wet mat of fiber, fragile still, barely holding together, and the papermaker had to transfer this, lift it somehow, press it onto a felt cloth or smooth board, and this required steady hands, confidence, because one wrong move and the wet sheet would tear, would collapse back into formless pulp, stack upon stack, wet sheets separated by felts, and then the pressing weights placed on top, or a screw press if the workshop had one, squeezing out more water, compressing the fibers even closer together, and those hydrogen bonds, those molecular attractions between cellulose chains, they began to form, creating strength, creating paper. After pressing came drying, and this too required patience, hanging the sheets or laying them on heated surfaces, watching as the remaining moisture evaporated, as the fibers contracted slightly, tightening their grip on one another, and the paper that emerged was pale, almost luminous, with a subtle texture from the screen pattern pressed into its surface. The Chinese paper makers experimented, naturally, because human curiosity demands it. They tried different plant fibers, bamboo, rice straw, the bark of different trees, and each material brought its own qualities. Bamboo created a harder paper, more resistant to insects, while certain tree barks produced softer, more absorbent sheets. They added sizing too, coating the paper with starch or animal gelatin, creating a barrier that prevented ink from spreading, from feathering across the surface, and this treatment transformed paper from merely possible to truly practical. Because what good is a writing surface if the characters blur and run? The earliest papers were precious, used for important documents, official records, imperial decrees. But as production increased, as more workshops learned the techniques, Paper became more available. Scholars could afford it. Artists could experiment with it. And Chinese culture, with its reverence for calligraphy and painting, found in paper the perfect medium. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, papermaking had become refined, sophisticated, different regions developing their own specialties, their own secret techniques passed from master to apprentice, and the knowledge began to leak outward, traveling along the Silk Road, carried by merchants and monks, by prisoners of war who had worked in paper workshops. Korea received the knowledge early, perhaps by the 4th century, and Korean papermakers took the techniques and adapted them, using their own local fibers, creating papers that were remarkably strong, that could last for centuries. Papers made from mulberry bark, processed with such care that the finished sheets had an almost silken quality. Japan learned from Korea, and this transmission, probably in the 6th or 7th century, sparked another evolution, because the Japanese, with their aesthetic sensibility, their attention to subtle beauty, they approached papermaking as an art form, not merely a craft. The washi tradition emerged, using kozo, gampi, mitsumata, different plant fibers that each brought distinct characteristics. And the Japanese papermakers developed techniques of extraordinary refinement, creating papers so thin they seemed almost transparent, or papers thick and strong enough to be used in architecture, in screens and sliding doors. But I'm moving too quickly, because back in the heartland, in China during the Tang Dynasty, in the 7th and 8th centuries, paper had become commonplace enough that it was used for everything, for printing, for wrapping, for making money, actual currency printed on paper, a concept that seemed almost magical, that something so light could hold value. The woodblock printing revolution depended entirely on paper, because you needed a surface that could receive ink evenly, that could be pressed against carved blocks without tearing, and paper, with its uniform surface and its strength, it made possible the reproduction of Buddhist sutras, the spread of knowledge beyond the monastery walls, and still the knowledge moved westward, reaching Samarkand, that crossroads city where cultures collided and traded, and here, around the year 750, according to legend, Chinese papermakers were captured during a battle, brought to this Central Asian city, and forced to share their techniques. Whether the story is precisely true or not, papermaking did take root in Samarkand, and from there it spread into the Islamic world, carried by scholars and artisans who recognized its value, who saw that paper could preserve the Quran, could facilitate the explosion of learning that characterized the Islamic Golden Age. The Islamic papermakers adapted the Chinese techniques to their own materials, using linen rags primarily, because these were available in abundance, and linen fibers, long and strong, produced excellent paper, smooth and white, perfect for the flowing Arabic script, for the geometric patterns of Islamic art. Baghdad became a center of papermaking by the 8th century, and the paper produced there was famous for its quality, its durability, and as Islam spread, so did the knowledge of paper to Damascus, to Cairo, to Morocco, each region establishing its own workshops, its own traditions. In medieval Spain, in cities like Toledo and Valencia, under Moorish rule, paper-making flourished, and this is where Europe finally encountered the technique, because the Christian kingdoms, watching from the north, they saw something valuable, something that could transform their own limited writing culture. But Europe, conservative in its traditions, resistant to change, Europe clung to parchment, to vellum, those surfaces made from animal skin, and there were good reasons for this resistance. Parchment was familiar, trusted. It lasted centuries if properly stored. It had the weight and feel of permanence. Parchment making was its own ancient craft, stretching back to Pergamum, that Greek city from which the name derived, and the process was entirely different from paper, starting not with plants but with animals, with sheep and goats and calves, whose skins, after slaughter, became raw material. The skins were soaked in lime, a caustic bath that loosened the hair, made it easy to scrape away, and then more scraping, removing every trace of flesh, of fat, of the membrane that had once held muscle to skin. And this work was hard, physical, requiring strength and precision. Stretched on frames, the wet skins were pulled taut, dried under tension, and as they dried they became translucent in places, creamy white or pale yellow, and the surface was scraped again, smoothed with pumice until it achieved that characteristic velvety texture, until it could accept ink without the characters spreading. The finest parchment, called vellum, came from calf skin, and this material was extraordinarily expensive because you could only get so much writing surface from one animal, and a single illuminated manuscript, a Bible or a book of hours, might require the skins of dozens, even hundreds, of animals. So European monasteries, with their scriptoria, their copying rooms where monks labored over manuscripts, they had vast investments in parchment, in the suppliers who provided it, in the techniques of working with it, and paper, this foreign material from the East. It seemed suspect, fragile, impermanent. But gradually, through the 13th and 14th centuries, paper began to establish itself in Europe, first in Italy, where merchants trading with the Islamic world understood its practicality, its economy, and the first Italian paper mills appeared, driven by water wheels, powered by rivers flowing down from the Alps. These mills represented an innovation, a mechanization of what had been entirely hand labor, because the beating of rags into pulp, that exhausting rhythmic pounding, it could be done by wooden hammers lifted and dropped by water power, and the sound of these stampers rising and falling, crashing down on wet rags, it echoed through valleys, a constant percussion that marked the presence of a paper mill. The Italian paper makers used linen rags, cotton rags, anything made from plant fiber that had already been processed into thread, into cloth. And these textiles, worn out from years of use, they were collected by rag merchants, sorted by quality, sold to the mills where they began their second life. White rags produced white paper, naturally, while colored fabrics created tinted sheets, and the paper makers learned to sort carefully, to separate the finest linens from the coarser materials, because quality control began here, at the very beginning, with the selection of raw materials. The rags were chopped into smaller pieces, fed into the stamping mills, where those massive wooden hammers, studded sometimes with nails or metal points, they pounded the fabric hour after hour, day after day, breaking down the weave, separating the individual fibers, reducing everything to pulp. Water flowed constantly through the process, washing, diluting, carrying away impurities, and the consistency had to be monitored, adjusted, because too thick and the paper would be uneven, too thin and it would be weak, transparent, unsuitable for writing. The Vat Man, that was his title, his role in the workshop. He stood at the large wooden vat filled with diluted pulp, and his skill determined everything, the quality of each sheet, the thickness, the uniformity, because his hands controlled the mold. His movements created the paper. He dipped the mold, that rectangular frame with its wire screen, into the vat, submerging it at just the right angle, and then lifted it horizontally with a practiced shake, a subtle motion that distributed the fibers evenly across the screen, and the water drained through, leaving behind a thin layer of interlaced fibers. The shake was everything. Too gentle, and the fibers would settle unevenly. Too vigorous, and they would wash off the screen entirely. And this knowledge came only through experience, through making sheet after sheet, thousands of sheets, until the motion became automatic, instinctive. And there was beauty in watching it, the way the wet fibers caught the light, the way they transformed from liquid suspension to solid sheet in just seconds, and each mold left its mark, the pattern of the wire screen, the laid lines running one direction, the chain lines crossing perpendicular, pressed into the paper's surface like a fingerprint, like proof of its handmade origin. The coucher, the second worker, he received each wet sheet, carefully transferring it from the mold to a piece of felt. And this required perfect timing, perfect coordination between the two workers, because the vat man was already dipping again, creating the next sheet, and the rhythm couldn't break, couldn't pause. Stack after stack accumulated, wet paper alternating with felt. And when enough sheets had been made, maybe 100, maybe more, the stack went into the press, a massive screw press, and slowly, with tremendous force, the water was squeezed out, the fibers compressed, and those molecular bonds, those hydrogen connections between cellulose chains, they locked the fibers together, creating strength, creating permanence. After pressing, the sheets were separated from the felts carefully because they were still damp, still fragile, and hung to dry, draped over ropes or wooden poles in airy lofts. And the drying time depended on humidity, on temperature, on air circulation, days or even weeks sometimes, waiting for the moisture to evaporate completely. But even dry, the paper wasn't finished, because unsized paper without treatment, it absorbed ink like a sponge. The characters would blur, spread, become illegible. And so the sheets were sized, dipped into a solution of animal gelatin, rendered from scraps of parchment, from bones and hides, creating a protein coating that sealed the surface, that made the paper hold ink cleanly. After sizing came more drying, more waiting, and then the final step, the burnishing, rubbing the surface with smooth stones, polishing it until it achieved a slight sheen, until it was ready to receive writing, to become the vessel for human thought. And each mill developed its reputation, its specialty. Some produced thick papers for ledgers and legal documents. Others made thin sheets for correspondence, and they marked their papers with watermarks, designs created by shaping wire and sewing it to the mold, so that where the wire design sat, less fiber accumulated, creating a translucent image visible when the paper was held to light. These watermarks became signatures, Proof of origin. A bull's head might indicate one mill, an anchor another, and collectors today can date old papers, trace their origins, just by examining these ghostly images embedded in the fiber itself. France developed its own paper-making tradition, particularly in the Champagne region, near Troyes, where clear streams provided power and water, and French papers became known for their quality, their consistency, competing with Italian production for the European market. The Netherlands, too, with its advanced hydraulic engineering, its understanding of water management. The Dutch established mills that produced papers in tremendous quantities, and Dutch paper became standard for many purposes, for printing especially, as books multiplied and literacy spread. Germany, England, Spain, each country established its paper industry. Each adapted the techniques to local conditions, local materials, and slowly, inexorably, paper displaced parchment, not because parchment was inferior, but because paper was cheaper, faster to produce, more available. A scribe in the 15th century working on parchment, he might complete a few pages in a day, cutting his quills, mixing his inks, working with precious material that couldn't be wasted. But that same scribe with paper, he could be more experimental, more free, because mistakes were less costly, because paper, while still valuable, wasn't prohibitively expensive. And then came printing, Gutenberg's revolution, movable type, and suddenly the demand for paper exploded, because books, thousands of copies of a single text, they required thousands of sheets, and only paper could meet this demand. Only paper was abundant enough, affordable enough, uniform enough. The printing press and paper, they were partners, co-creators of a revolution in knowledge, and European paper mills expanded, mechanized further, sought efficiencies, because the appetite for printed material seemed insatiable. But even as paper became common, even as it transformed European culture, enabled the Reformation, facilitated the scientific revolution, carried news and ideas across continents, the basic process remained remarkably similar to what Chinese papermakers had developed more than 1,000 years earlier. Rags into pulp, pulp onto screens, pressing, drying, sizing, the fundamental chemistry of cellulose fiber, the physics of hydrogen bonding. These couldn't change, because they were inherent to the material itself, to what paper was and is. Each sheet, whether made in 18th century France or 10th century China, it represented the same miracle. Plant fiber reorganized, transformed from its original purpose, no longer part of a living organism, no longer fabric, but something new, a surface that could hold marks, preserve symbols, carry meaning across time, and the texture varied, naturally, depending on the skill of the maker, the quality of the materials. Italian papers might be smoother, more refined, while rougher provincial papers showed more variation, more character, the individual fibers visible if you looked closely, if you ran your fingers across the surface. The smell of paper mills, that must have been distinctive, the sour tang of fermenting rags, the wet wool scent of felts constantly damp, the sizing vats with their animal gelatin, and underlying everything, the clean smell of cellulose, of plant fiber, earthy and slightly sweet. In the sizing room, where sheets were dipped in heated gelatin, the air would be humid, warm, and the smell more intense, almost meaty, because this was animal protein, rendered connective tissue, and it created a surface that transformed the paper's relationship with ink, made writing possible, made permanence achievable. The finished papers, when held to the nose, they carried a subtle scent, not unpleasant, a hint of the gelatin perhaps, the clean smell of dried fiber, and papers aged, their scent changing, becoming drier, dustier, that characteristic smell of old books, of archives, of libraries, where centuries of paper breathed together in climate-controlled silence. Different fibers created different papers. Linen produced strong sheets with a slight sheen. Cotton made softer paper, more absorbent, and papermakers became expert at judging, at feeling a rag between their fingers and knowing what kind of paper it would yield, what characteristics it would bring. The workshops developed hierarchies, gradations of quality, with first-rate papers reserved for important documents, for fine printing, for art, and lesser grades used for wrapping, for everyday correspondence, for purposes where longevity didn't matter as much. And papermakers guarded their techniques, their specific methods, the exact timing of their processes, because in a competitive market, quality meant reputation. Reputation meant survival, and a master papermaker's knowledge, accumulated over decades, that was valuable, not worth protecting. Apprentices learned slowly, over years, watching and assisting, gradually being trusted with more responsibility, moving from preparation of materials to the actual making and the final skill. The vatman's art, that came last, because it required not just technique, but judgment, sensitivity, an almost intuitive understanding of how the pulp would behave. The seasons affected everything. Winter meant slower drying, colder water that changed how fibers suspended. Summer brought faster production, but also the risk of pulp souring, fermenting in the vats, and mills adjusted their rhythms accordingly, working with nature rather than fighting against it. In some regions, particularly in Asia, papermakers added other substances to the pulp: rice, starch, plant mucilages, materials that helped the fibers bond, that added sizing properties directly into the sheet rather than applying them afterward. And these additions created papers with distinct characteristics, different feels, different behaviors. With ink, Japanese papermakers, pursuing their aesthetic vision, they developed techniques of extraordinary subtlety, adding delicate fibers, flower petals sometimes, creating papers that were art objects in themselves. And the Naga Shizuki method, their particular approach to sheet formation, it involved a different motion, a more complex interaction with the pulp, allowing for the creation of papers impossibly thin, yet remarkably strong. The fibers in Japanese paper, especially kozo, they were longer than those in European papers, and this length created strength, allowed the paper to be pulled thin without tearing, and when held to light, these papers seemed almost luminous, translucent, but not transparent, glowing with an inner quality, Korean hanji, made with such care that single sheets could last a millennium. Papermakers there developed techniques of repeated beating, of careful processing that preserved fiber length while creating thorough bonding, and hanji could be twisted, folded, used in ways that would destroy ordinary paper. But in Europe, as the 18th century progressed, as industrialization began to transform every craft, papermakers faced new pressures, demands for greater quantity, faster production, lower costs, and the traditional methods, beautiful as they were, couldn't scale to meet the appetite of an increasingly literate population. The first innovations were mechanical, better stampers, more efficient presses, but the fundamental bottleneck remained, the vat man and his mold, because each sheet required individual attention, individual formation, and there was only so fast a human being could work, even a skilled one, and the raw materials too. They were becoming scarce because rags, the foundation of European papermaking, they depended on textile production, on worn-out clothing and linens, and the supply couldn't expand quickly enough, couldn't keep pace with demand. Papermakers began experimenting, searching for alternatives. Could you make paper from wood directly, from a straw, from other plant materials that were more abundant than rags? And these experiments were largely unsuccessful at first. They pointed toward a future transformation, though that future was still decades away. The color of paper, this too was evolving, because earlier papers often had a cream or ivory tone, the natural color of aged linen, of cotton. But as bleaching techniques improved, as papermakers learned to use chlorine, papers became whiter, brighter, and this whiteness became associated with quality, with purity, though some papers were deliberately colored. Blue papers, gray papers, created by adding dyes to the pulp. And these colored sheets served specific purposes: decorative end papers for books, specialty items, papers that announced their purpose through their tint. The texture of the paper surface, this varied with the mold. Wove. Paper came from molds with a very fine wire cloth screen, creating a surface without the prominent laid and chain lines, smoother, more uniform, and wove paper became preferred for certain kinds of printing, for illustrations especially, where fine detail mattered. Laid paper, with its distinctive line pattern, it remained standard for many purposes, for writing papers particularly, because the texture provided a subtle resistance, a feedback under the pen, and some writers preferred this, found the slight texture helped control the flow of ink. The watermarks grew more elaborate, becoming not just mill marks but decorative elements, images of animals, crests, initials, and the skill of the watermark maker, bending and soldering fine wire into intricate designs. This became its own specialty, its own craft within the craft. Holding an old piece of paper to the light, examining its watermark, you could read history, trace trade routes, identify the mill where it was made, perhaps even the year, because many marks included dates, and this embedded information, invisible except in transmitted light. It fascinates still, this secret writing in the paper itself, the feel of handmade paper. Even now, it's distinctive. There's a slight irregularity, a decal edge where the pulp seeped under the mold's frame, creating a feathered border, and this imperfection, this evidence of the hand, it became valued, treasured, proof that the paper was made with care, with attention. By the 19th century, the transformation accelerated, the Industrial Revolution bringing new machinery, new possibilities, and the Fourdrinier machine, invented in the early 1800s, it mechanized sheet formation, creating continuous webs of paper, endless rolls rather than individual sheets. The machine used a moving screen, a wire mesh belt, and pulp was poured onto this moving surface, water draining as it traveled, and the paper formed continuously, passing through presses, overheated rollers, emerging dry at the other end. And the speed, the quantity, it was revolutionary, transformative. But something was lost too, because machine-made paper, uniform and efficient as it was, it lacked the subtle variations, the character of handmade sheets, the fibers all aligned in one direction from the machine's motion, creating papers that tore easily along that grain, that behaved differently than the random fiber orientation of hand-formed sheets. And as wood pulp processes were perfected, as paper makers learned to break down wood fibers chemically, dissolving the lignin that made wood rigid, papers became even cheaper, more abundant, but also less stable, because wood pulp papers, especially those made with mechanical processes that left lignin in, they yellowed, became brittle, degraded in ways that rag papers never did. The great libraries, preserving books from the 19th century, they face this crisis still, because books printed on wood pulp paper, they're crumbling, acidifying, destroying themselves from within, while books from earlier centuries, printed on rag paper, they remain supple, readable, preserved by the chemistry of their materials. Yet the abundance that industrial papermaking created, it enabled things impossible before, newspapers reaching millions, books becoming affordable to ordinary people, universal education requiring millions upon millions of sheets for students' notebooks and textbooks. And perhaps the trade was necessary, longevity for accessibility, permanence for democracy. The craft tradition continued, though, in smaller workshops, in studios where artists needed particular papers, handmade papers for watercolors, for printmaking, for calligraphy. And these artisan paper makers, they kept the old knowledge alive, adapted it, experimented with new fibers, new techniques, creating papers that were works of art themselves. In Japan, the Mingei movement, the celebration of folk crafts, it helped preserve traditional papermaking, recognizing washi as a cultural treasure, and papermakers continued working by hand, using methods passed down through generations, creating papers for shoji screens, for origami, for the restoration of ancient texts, the smell of a traditional paper workshop. Even today, it carries echoes of the past, wet fiber, clean and vegetal, the sizing vats, if animal gelatin is still used, or the newer synthetic sizes with their chemical tang, and always underlying everything, that fundamental scent of cellulose, of plant material transformed. Running your hands across different papers, you can feel the history. Rough handmade sheets with their irregular surface, smooth machine-made papers, the crisp snap of sized paper versus the soft absorbency of unsized. And each texture tells a story about how it was made, what it was meant for, who valued it enough to create it. The transition from parchment to paper, it took centuries in Europe, and parchment never entirely disappeared. It remained the choice for certain documents, diplomas, legal instruments, anything requiring the weight of permanence, the gravitas of tradition. But paper won, ultimately, not because it was better in every way, but because it was good enough and abundant and cheap enough that knowledge could spread, that ordinary people could own books, could write letters, could participate in the world of written communication that had once been reserved for elites. And yet, in that victory, in that abundance, something subtle shifted, because when writing materials are scarce, expensive, Every word carries weight, requires consideration, but when paper is cheap, readily available, the relationship changes. Writing becomes more casual, more disposable, and perhaps we lost some reverence, some sense of the precious. Still, holding a piece of fine paper, really noticing it, feeling its weight, its texture, seeing how it takes ink, how light passes through it. There's something there, a connection to all those centuries of human ingenuity, all those hands that learned to transform plant into surface, fiber into possibility, the chemistry of it, the molecular dance that happens when cellulose fibers bond. It's the same whether the paper maker works in ancient China or medieval Italy or modern Japan, because chemistry doesn't change, doesn't respect culture or time. The hydroxyl groups on cellulose molecules, they reach out, form hydrogen bonds with neighboring molecules. And this network of attractions, billions upon billions of tiny connections, they create the strength we call paper. And there's something profound in that, in the universality of it, that human beings in completely separate civilizations with no contact, no shared knowledge, they all discovered this same transformation, all learned to break down plant fiber and reconstitute it, all found their way to paper or something very like it. Perhaps it speaks to necessity, to the deep human need to preserve thought, to send messages across distance and time. And when that need is strong enough, minds turn toward solutions, experiment, observe, learn from failure, and eventually, independently, arrive at similar answers. The sensory memory of paper, it must be among the most common human experiences. The rustle of turning pages, the slight resistance of a pen moving across a textured surface. The way paper smells differently when it's new versus old, fresh versus damp. The visual pleasure of cream-colored laid paper versus bright white wove. Children learning to write. They develop relationships with paper. The wide-ruled notebook paper of early grades. The way crayon feels different than pencil. How markers sometimes bleed through. And these tactile lessons, they're learning about absorbency, about sizing, about fiber structure, without knowing the words, just through direct experience. Artists choose their papers with extraordinary care because the surface determines everything. Watercolor paper must absorb pigment while holding its shape when wet. Printmaking papers need to withstand pressure, to capture fine detail from an etched plate and the wrong paper. It can ruin the work, while the right paper elevates it, becomes an integral part of the art itself. The Japanese concept of kami, the word means both paper and spirit, and while this may be linguistic coincidence, there's poetry in it, in the idea that paper holds something essential, something beyond mere utility, that it's worthy of reverence, of careful attention. In traditional bookbinding, the choice of paper matters not just for the text pages, but for the end papers, the marbled sheets that line the covers, the tissue protecting illustrations, and a fine binding uses different papers for different purposes, each selected for its specific qualities, its role in the whole. The watermarks, those ghostly images, they remind us that paper is translucent, that light passes through it, and this quality, this semi-transparency, it's part of what makes paper feel alive somehow, because it interacts with light, changes appearance depending on how it's lit, whether you're looking at it or through it, holding very old paper. paper from the 17th or 18th century, there's often a suppleness to it, a flexibility that seems surprising given its age, because good rag paper, properly made and stored, it doesn't become brittle. The long fibers retain their strength, their ability to bend without breaking, and this longevity, it wasn't planned exactly, but it emerged from the materials, from the methods, from the chemistry of cellulose and the physics of fiber. The evolution of paper, from precious to common, it parallels other technologies, other materials that began rare and expensive and gradually became everyday. But paper's journey seems particularly important, particularly transformative, because it democratized knowledge, made literacy possible for masses of people, enabled revolutions, both political and intellectual. Yet handmade paper persists, not as a primary technology, but as an art, a craft, a connection to slower ways of making, and people still learn the process, still set up vats and molds in workshops and studios, still find satisfaction in the direct engagement in transforming fiber into sheet through their own hands and judgment, the smell of pulp in a vat, wet and clean and slightly sweet, the sound of water draining through a screen, the visual beauty of fibers settling, interlacing, these sensory experiences. They connect contemporary papermakers to an unbroken tradition stretching back more than a millennium. And there's something moving in that continuity, in the knowledge that the essential process hasn't changed, can't change, because it's rooted in the nature of the materials themselves. Modern papers made for specific purposes, archival papers that resist acid degradation, papers embedded with security features, papers designed to survive specific conditions. They represent sophistication built on ancient foundations, the same basic transformation elevated by understanding, by chemistry, by engineering, but still fundamentally fiber and water and bonding. And perhaps that's the deepest lesson, that some technologies, some human innovations, they reach a kind of completion, a rightness of method that doesn't need radical reinvention, only refinement, only adaptation to new circumstances while preserving the essential truth at the core. The closing of a book, the soft sound of pages settling together, or the crisp fold of a letter, the way paper creases, holds a shape when bent. These everyday interactions, they're possible because of everything that came before, because of reeds in the Nile and mulberry bark in China, and water mills in medieval France. Paper surrounds us still, even in this digital age. Receipts and labels and packaging, cards and tickets and certificates, newspapers folding in half, pages in journals, and though we use less of it perhaps than previous generations, it hasn't disappeared, hasn't been entirely superseded, because there's something irreplaceable in the physical, in the tangible, in marks made permanent on a surface you can hold, the texture under fingertips, the slight roughness or smoothness. It provides feedback, a sensory confirmation that something exists. That thought has been captured, fixed, made real in a way that pixels on a screen, however bright, however clear, they somehow aren't standing in an archive, surrounded by centuries of paper, documents and letters and ledgers, the collective smell of all that fiber, all that sizing, all those years. It's like standing in a forest of human memory, of preserved thought, and the paper itself, the material, it made this preservation possible, this accumulation of recorded knowledge, the future of paper. It's uncertain in some ways, but perhaps certain in others, because as long as people make art, as long as we value the handmade, the unique, the beautiful, there will be paper makers working with fiber and water, creating surfaces that carry not just information but character, presence, soul, and sometimes late at night perhaps, in the quiet, you might pick up a piece of fine paper, really look at it, hold it to the light and see the fibers, the watermark if there is one, feel its weight, its texture, and in that moment you're connected to everything, to the reeds and the mulberry bark, to the rags and the watermills, to hands that learned through centuries how to transform the fibrous structure of plants into something that could hold human thought, human feeling, human knowledge. The paper rests in your hands, cream or white, or rough or smooth, and it waits, patient as paper always is, ready to receive whatever marks you choose to make, whatever words or images you need to preserve. And this readiness, this receptivity, it's paper's gift, its purpose, its quiet ongoing service to human expression. The workshops are quieter now, fewer than there were, but they exist still, and in them water pours into vats, molds dip and lift, fibers settle and bond, and new sheets emerge, one after another, continuing a tradition so old that its origins blur into legend, into the misty territory where history and story overlap. And perhaps that's fitting, that paper's beginnings are themselves written on an uncertain surface, because paper, more than almost any other material, it exists to hold stories, to preserve them, to carry them forward, and so its own story, endless and evolving, it continues, sheet by sheet, fiber by fiber, in workshops and mills and studios around the world. Wherever someone understands that this transformation, this simple miracle of plant into surface, it matters, it endures, it remains, the thought drifts now, settles like fibers in a vat, and what remains is texture, weight, the ghost of watermarks held to light, the memory of pages turning, the rustle and whisper of paper, patient, present, waiting. I imagine a place beyond the edges of waking thought, a realm where the borders between earth and sky dissolve into something older, something that breathes with the rhythm of countless ages. There is a quality to certain stories that makes them feel less like tales and more like returning, as if the mind already knows these shapes, these names, these faces that peer through the mist of time with eyes both human and infinite. Tonight, the journey leads toward the peaks of mountains that touch the ceiling of the world, toward rivers that have flowed since before memory began to keep its records, toward a tradition so vast and layered that it seems to contain multitudes within multitudes, like nesting dolls carved from starlight and devotion. The gods of the Hindu tradition are not simple, they are not singular, they are oceans of meaning, forests of symbolism, skies filled with stories that overlap and interweave, until the boundary between one tale and another becomes as permeable as morning fog. Imagine standing at the edge of a great river at dawn, the Ganges perhaps, or the Yamuna, waters that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, that have carried the prayers of billions, that flow with a patience that makes a human urgency seem like the flutter of a moth's wing. The mist rises from the surface, and in that mist, shapes begin to form, not quite solid, not quite dream. They are presences with forms that shift according to the needs of those who seek them, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, always vast beyond the capacity of any single story to contain. This is not a tradition that asks for simplicity. It does not reduce the complexity of existence into neat categories or singular truths. Instead, it sprawls, it proliferates, it embraces paradox with the ease of a river accepting tributaries, each one adding to the whole without diminishing what came before. There are gods here who create and destroy in the same breath, goddesses who nurture and wage war with equal devotion, divine children who play games that determine the fate of worlds, and sages whose thoughts become the architecture of reality itself. To speak of these beings is to enter a landscape where time moves differently, where a single lifetime might span aeons, where a moment of meditation might contain the birth and death of universes, where the playful and the profound dance together without contradiction. The oldest texts speak in a language that feels like it was designed to be chanted, to be sung, to vibrate in the chest and the skull until meaning arrives not through logic alone, but through resonance, through the body's understanding of rhythm and repetition. These are the Vedas, composed in Sanskrit, a tongue so precise that each syllable carries weight, carries power, carries layers of meaning that unfold like lotus petals in slow motion. And from these ancient hymns, these ritual formulas, these cosmic speculations, emerge the figures who will populate a tradition so rich that even after thousands of years, new interpretations continue to blossom like flowers in an endless spring. There is Brahma, the creator, often depicted with four faces looking in all directions, seeing all of time and space simultaneously, holding the Vedas themselves in his hands, embodying the principle of emergence, of manifestation, of the unfolding of potential into form. There is Vishnu, the preserver, who reclines on the cosmic serpent between cycles of creation, who descends into the world in avatar after avatar, taking form as fish, as tortoise, as boar, as half-lion, as dwarf, as warrior prince, as cowherd god, each incarnation a response to a specific crisis, a specific need, a specific imbalance that requires divine intervention. And there is Shiva, the destroyer and transformer, the ascetic meditating on Mount Kailash, the wild dancer whose movements create and dissolve reality, the Lord of contradictions who is both the ultimate renunciate and the devoted husband, both the terrible and the auspicious, holding in his being the necessary truth that destruction and creation are not opposites, but partners in the cosmic dance. These three form what later tradition will call the Trimurti, the triple form, the three aspects of the one divine principle, though even this framework is only one way of understanding, one lens among many through which to glimpse the infinite, because alongside these great gods are their consorts, their feminine counterparts who are not subordinate but essential, not secondary but foundational. Saraswati with her Veena, goddess of learning and music and the flowing of knowledge, Lakshmi with her lotuses, goddess of prosperity and grace and the abundance that nourishes life, Parvati in her many forms, from gentle mountain daughter to fierce warrior goddess, embodying Shakti, the divine feminine power that animates all existence. The landscape of this tradition includes countless other beings. Ganesha with his elephant head, remover of obstacles, lord of beginnings, patron of arts and sciences, Hanuman the monkey god, whose devotion knows no limits, whose strength serves righteousness, whose leap across the ocean becomes a symbol of faith transcending impossible distances. There are the planetary deities, the river goddesses, the sacred mountains personified, the principles of dawn and night given faces and names, the very elements themselves worshipped as divine presences, until the entire cosmos becomes populated with consciousness, with intention, with personality. This is a worldview that sees divinity not as distant or abstract, but as intimately woven into the fabric of existence, present in the stone of the temple and the water of the well, in the cow that gives milk and the tree that offers shade, in the guru who teaches and the parent who nurtures, in the beggar on the street who might be a god in disguise, testing the devotion and generosity of mortals. The stories told about these beings are not simple moral fables. They are complex narratives filled with surprising turns, with ethical ambiguities, with moments of profound beauty and shocking violence, with love that transcends death and jealousy that sparks cosmic wars. And as the mist continues to rise from that river at dawn, as the shapes within it become clearer and then dissolve again into formlessness, the invitation is simply to witness, to allow these stories and these beings to unfold at their own pace, to trust that understanding will come not through forcing or grasping, but through patient attention, through the slow accumulation of images and ideas that will gradually form their own constellation of meaning. The journey has just begun, and there are depths yet to explore. The roots reach back further than almost any other living tradition, back into a time when history and mythology had not yet separated into distinct categories, when the line between what was remembered and what was imagined remained beautifully blurred. In the river valleys of the Indian subcontinent, in a time scholars now place somewhere around 1,500 years before the Common Era, perhaps earlier, perhaps much earlier, groups of people were composing hymns, creating rituals, asking questions about the nature of existence with a sophistication that still startles those who encounter these texts for the first time. These were the Vedic people, and their world was one of fire altars and soma offerings, of priests who memorized thousands of verses with such precision that the oral tradition preserved exact syllables across countless generations, creating a living library carried in human memory. The oldest layer, the Rig Veda, contains 10 mandalas, 10 circles of hymns, and within these circles are prayers addressed to forces of nature that are already being personified, already being understood as conscious beings with preferences and personalities. There is Agni, the fire god, present in every hearth and every ritual flame, the messenger between human and divine realms, the witness to every sacrifice, the mouth of the gods that consumes offerings and transforms them into sacred smoke, rising toward heaven. There is Indra, the storm god, the warrior deity who drinks soma and grows mighty, who wields the thunderbolt, who battles the serpent demon Vritra to release the waters, to bring rain, to make the world fertile and habitable. His exploits recounted in hymn after hymn with a vigor and celebration that makes the ancient poetry pulse with energy. There is Varuna, keeper of cosmic order, guardian of Rita, the principle of natural law and moral truth, he who knows all secrets, who sees through darkness, whose 1,000 eyes observe every action, every thought, every deviation from the path of righteousness. And there is Surya, the sun, and Ushas, the dawn, and Vayu, the wind, and the Ashvins, the divine horsemen who race across the sky, each deity embodying some aspect of the natural world while also transcending it, possessing stories and relationships that make them more than mere personifications. But even in these earliest texts, there are hints of something more, questions that probe beneath the surface of polytheistic worship, hymns that ask where these gods came from, whether they too had an origin, whether there might be something prior even to them. The Nasadya Sukta, the hymn of creation, poses questions rather than providing answers. It describes a time before being and non-being existed, before death or immortality, before day or night, a primordial state of potential from which everything emerged. And it ends by wondering whether even the highest gods know the secret of creation, or whether that knowledge belongs to something beyond naming. This philosophical questioning would only deepen over time. But in the Vedic period, the focus remained largely on ritual, on the proper performance of sacrifices, on maintaining the relationship between human and divine through offerings, through praise, through the careful pronunciation of sacred syllables. The priests who performed these rituals were the Brahmins, a class of specialists who devoted their lives to mastering the complex procedures, the exact intonations, the precise gestures required to make the sacrifices efficacious. They were the keepers of sacred knowledge, the intermediaries between worlds. And the rituals themselves could be elaborate affairs, lasting for days, sometimes for years, involving multiple priests, hundreds of verses, offerings of grain and ghee and animals, the construction of temporary fire, altars with geometrically precise dimensions, the whole enterprise designed to maintain cosmic order, to ensure the prosperity of kings, to secure blessings for the community. Within this ritual framework, the gods were present as honored guests, as powerful allies, as beings who could be pleased or offended, who had their favorite offerings and their preferred modes of address, who might grant sons or wealth or victory in battle if properly propitiated. But the Vedic corpus is vast, and it evolved over centuries, and gradually the focus began to shift from external ritual to internal understanding, from the mechanics of sacrifice to the meaning behind the symbols. The later portions of the Vedas, the Brahmanas, contained detailed explanations of ritual procedures, but they also included stories, mythological narratives that explained why certain practices existed, that connected ritual actions to cosmic events, that made the sacrifice itself a reenactment of creation. And then came the Aranyakas, the forest texts, composed by those who had withdrawn from village life, who meditated in wilderness places, who sought understanding through contemplation rather than through elaborate ceremony, and finally the Upanishads, perhaps the most revolutionary texts in the entire tradition, dialogues between teachers and students, between sages and kings, between seekers and those who had found, conversations that turned the attention inward, that asked not about the gods out there, but about the divine principle within. The Upanishads introduced concepts that would transform the entire tradition, the idea of Brahman, the ultimate reality, the ground of all being, infinite, eternal, beyond all qualities, yet the source of all qualities, not a god among gods, but the reality that underlies gods and humans and all of existence, and the idea of Atman, the inner self, the consciousness that witnesses all experience, that persists through all changes, that is, in the most radical formulation, identical with Brahman, the famous equation tat tvam asi, that thou art, collapsing the distinction between the individual soul and the cosmic absolute. These were not ideas that replaced the gods, rather they recontextualized them. The deities of the Vedic pantheon remained important, remained objects of worship and devotion, but they were now understood as manifestations, as particular expressions of the one ultimate reality, as faces that the formless shows to those who need form. This philosophical development occurred gradually, over centuries, in different regions with different emphases. There was no single moment of revelation, no founder declaring a new doctrine. Instead, there was an organic evolution, a slow maturation of ideas through countless conversations, countless meditations, countless moments of insight accumulated and refined. And during this same long period, the society itself was developing the structures that would characterize it for millennia. The Varna system, the division into Brahmins, who performed rituals, Kshatriyas, who governed and fought, Vaishyas, who engaged in commerce and agriculture, and Shudras, who provided service, each group with its own duties, its own dharma, its own role in maintaining the cosmic and social order. The concept of dharma itself became central, this word that means law, duty, righteousness, cosmic order, the way things should be. It was dharma that held everything together, that gave each being its proper place, its proper function, and the gods were understood as guardians and exemplars of dharma, as beings whose actions demonstrated what it meant to live in accordance with cosmic law. But dharma was not simple, not uniform. It varied according to one's station in life, one's age, one's circumstances. What was dharma for a warrior might be adharma for a priest. What was appropriate in youth might be forbidden in old age. The tradition embraced this complexity, this contextual ethics that refused to reduce moral life to simple commandments. Alongside dharma came the ideas of karma and samsara, the understanding that actions have consequences that extend beyond a single lifetime, that the soul transmigrates from body to body, experiencing the fruits of past deeds, creating through each action the conditions for future existence. This was not originally a Vedic concept. It appeared in the Upanishads without clear precedent, and it fundamentally altered the religious landscape, because now the question was not just how to please the gods or perform correct rituals, but how to escape the cycle altogether, how to achieve moksha, liberation, release from the wheel of birth and death. Different paths emerged, different methods proposed for achieving this liberation. The path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga, through direct realization of one's identity with Brahman. The path of meditation and withdrawal, leading to the development of what would become yoga in its classical forms. And the path of action, Karma Yoga, performing one's duty without attachment to results. And woven through all of this, the gods continued to evolve, to accumulate new attributes, new stories, new forms of worship. Indra, the great warrior of the Vedas, began to fade somewhat in importance, while other deities grew in stature and complexity. Rudra, a fierce deity mentioned in the Vedas, associated with storms and healing, with the wilderness and the terrifying aspects of nature, gradually transformed into Shiva, acquiring attributes and myths that made him one of the great gods of the tradition. No longer just a dangerous force to be appeased, but a complex figure embodying contradiction, the ascetic and the householder, the destroyer and the transformer, the lord of yoga and the cosmic dancer. And Vishnu, who in the Vedas was a relatively minor solar deity, known mainly for taking 3 steps to measure the universe, began to grow in significance, to accumulate a mythology of preservation and intervention, of descending into the world to restore balance whenever dharma declined. The idea of the avatar, the descent, the divine incarnation, became particularly associated with Vishnu, and stories began to be told of his various forms. The fish who saved Manu from the flood, the tortoise who supported the mountain used to churn the cosmic ocean, the boar who rescued the earth from the depths, each myth addressing some crisis, some threat to the cosmic order that required divine response. These were not yet the fully developed narratives that would appear in later texts, but the seeds were being planted. The mythological imagination was at work, connecting different stories, harmonizing different traditions, creating ever more elaborate frameworks for understanding the divine. And the goddess, who had been present in the Vedas in various forms, as Ushas, the dawn, as Vak, the sacred speech, as Prithvi, the earth, began to be understood in more unified ways, as Shakti, as Devi, as the divine feminine principle that was not subordinate to the masculine but essential, the power without which even the greatest gods could not act. This was a slow emergence happening across different regions with different emphases. In some areas, the goddess traditions remained local and distinct. In others, they began to coalesce into pan-Indian forms, but the recognition of divine feminine power as fundamental to the cosmos was growing, deepening, preparing the ground for later developments. The period between the composition of the early Upanishads and the beginning of the Common Era was one of remarkable ferment. Buddhism and Jainism emerged during this time, offering alternative paths, challenging certain Vedic assumptions while accepting others, and the tradition that would come to be called Hinduism responded with its own creativity, its own evolution. The gods were not static figures. They were living presences in the imagination and devotion of countless people, and they grew, changed, absorbed influences, merged with local deities, took on regional characteristics, became simultaneously more universal and more particular, more philosophical and more accessible, more abstract and more personal. By the time the Common Era began, the foundations were in place for the great flooring that would come. The epics were being composed. The Puranas were beginning to take shape. New forms of devotion were emerging, and the gods of the Hindu tradition were ready to enter their classical period, their time of fullest elaboration and most magnificent storytelling. But that development belonged to the future. For now, in this early period, the essential patterns had been established, the questions had been asked, the paths had been marked, and the divine beings who would walk those paths with humanity for thousands of years to come had begun to reveal their natures, their stories, their inexhaustible capacity to meet human longing with forms both terrible and beautiful, both familiar and utterly beyond comprehension. The great turning came with the epics, those massive narrative oceans that would shape the religious imagination of the subcontinent for millennia, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Texts so vast and so embedded in cultural consciousness that they ceased to be merely stories and became something more like shared dreams, collective memories of a time when gods walked among mortals and every action carried cosmic weight. The Mahabharata, attributed to the sage Vyasa, grew over centuries through oral transmission and gradual accretion until it reached a length of some 100,000 verses, making it perhaps the longest poem ever composed, a work so encyclopedic that it contains within itself philosophies and myths and genealogies and legal discussions and romantic interludes and battlefield descriptions of stunning brutality. At its heart lies a family conflict, a war between cousins, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, fighting for control of a kingdom. But this human drama unfolds against a backdrop of divine intervention, because the Pandavas are themselves semi-divine, born through blessings to mothers whose husbands could not produce heirs, Yudhishthira, son of Dharma itself, Bhima, son of the wind god, Arjuna, son of Indra, and the twins Nakula and Sahadeva, sons of the celestial horsemen. And most crucially, their companion and charioteer is Krishna, who appears first as a prince, a cowherd, a political advisor, a friend, but who reveals himself at the pivotal moment before battle as something infinitely greater, as Vishnu incarnate, as the Supreme Lord who contains all the gods within himself, all the worlds, all of time past and future. This revelation comes in the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of the Lord, that section of the epic that has become perhaps the most beloved and most commented upon text in the entire tradition. 700 verses of dialogue between Arjuna and Krishna on the battlefield, on the cusp of a war that will destroy most of the warriors assembled there. Arjuna falters, seeing his teachers and relatives and friends arrayed on both sides, recognizing that victory will require killing those he loves, and he lays down his weapons, refuses to fight, asks how such slaughter could ever be justified. And Krishna responds not with simple reassurance, but with teachings that unfold layer by layer, first addressing Arjuna's immediate concern, explaining that the soul is eternal, that bodies are merely garments changed from life to life, that the wise grieve neither for the living nor the dead because they understand the imperishable nature of the self. But the discourse deepens, expands. Krishna describes the path of selfless action, performing one's duty without attachment to results, acting in the world while remaining internally free. This is karma yoga, the way of engagement without bondage, of participation without entanglement. And then he speaks of devotion, of bhakti, of the path of loving surrender to the divine, describing how even those who cannot master meditation or renunciation can reach the highest goal through simple heartfelt worship, through offering flowers or water or even a leaf with sincere devotion, because what matters is not the grandeur of the offering, but the love with which it is given. And finally, when Arjuna asks to see Krishna's true form, the text describes a theophany, a vision of the cosmic form, the Vishvarupa, in which Arjuna perceives all of existence within Krishna's body, sees past and present and future simultaneously, sees gods and demons and humans being swallowed by time's inexorable flow, sees the entire universe as Krishna's play, his Leela, his dance of creation and dissolution. The description is overwhelming, terrifying, and beautiful at once. Arjuna sees Krishna as the source of all, as time itself devouring the worlds, as the beginning and middle and end of all beings, and he trembles, asks to see again the familiar gentle form of his friend, because the cosmic vision is more than human consciousness can bear for long. This text, this dialogue, introduced ideas that would reshape devotional practice throughout the tradition, the notion that God could be approached as friend, as beloved, as intimate companion rather than merely as distant transcendent reality. The idea that grace mattered more than ritual precision, that sincerity counted more than birth or learning. Krishna himself became the focus of intense devotional movements. His childhood stories elaborated in the Puranas, tales of the divine infant stealing butter, lifting mountains to protect cowherds from storms, dancing on the heads of serpents, playing his flute in the forests of Vrindavan, while the gopis, the cowherd women, abandoned their duties to dance with him in the moonlight. These stories of Krishna's youthful exploits, his ras leela, his circular dance of divine love, became potent symbols of the soul's longing for union with the divine. The gopis' illicit love for Krishna read as metaphor for the way spiritual seekers must abandon worldly attachments, must risk everything, must transgress ordinary dharma itself in pursuit of the highest truth. And alongside Krishna, the other avatar stories multiplied. Vishnu's descent as Ramas in the Ramayana, that other great epic, the tale of the prince exiled from his kingdom through palace intrigue, wandering the forests with his wife Sita and brother Lakshmana, facing the demon king Ravana who abducts Sita, building an army of monkeys and bears to cross the ocean to Lanka and rescue her. The Ramayana, attributed to the poet Valmiki, presents Rama as the ideal king, the perfect son, the devoted husband, Dharma embodied in human form, his story unfolding with a tragic grandeur, because even divine incarnations must suffer in the world of samsara, must face impossible choices and endure separation and loss. Sita herself becomes a model of virtue. Though later interpreters would struggle with aspects of her story, her trial by fire to prove her purity after rescue, her eventual abandonment by Rama due to public gossip, the text itself seems to recognize these tensions, these moments where Dharma demands cruelty, where righteousness requires sacrifice that feels unjust. But Rama's story also includes moments of profound devotion, particularly in the figure of Hanuman, the monkey god who serves Rama with absolute loyalty, who leaps across the ocean in a single bound, who carries mountains with healing herbs, who tears open his chest to show Rama and Sita enthroned in his heart. Hanuman became the exemplar of bhakti, of devotion so complete that it transcends all obstacles, so powerful that it grants superhuman strength and courage. These epics circulated through performance, through recitation, through traveling bards who would spend weeks or months telling the stories in villages across the subcontinent, and the gods within them became familiar presences, known intimately through repeated encounter, their personalities and preferences and stories woven into the fabric of daily life. And then came the Puranas, 18 major texts and numerous minor ones, encyclopedias of mythology and cosmology and genealogy, each Purana associated with one of the great gods, the Vishnu Purana, the Shiva Purana, the Devi Bhagavata Purana, texts that elaborated the myths hinted at in earlier sources, that created vast narrative universes around each deity. The Puranas describe the cycles of creation and dissolution, the kalpas and yugas, vast time periods that make human history seem like the blink of an eye. They describe how Brahma creates the universe from a lotus growing from Vishnu's navel, how that universe exists for billions of years before dissolving back into the cosmic ocean, how this cycle repeats endlessly, creation and destruction as the breath of the divine. They tell the story of the churning of the milk ocean, how gods and demons work together to extract the nectar of immortality, how Vishnu took the form of a beautiful woman to distract the demons while the gods drank the Amrita, how various treasures emerged from the churning, including Lakshmi herself, rising from the waters on a lotus, choosing Vishnu as her consort. They elaborate Shiva's mythology, his marriage to Sati, who immolates herself when her father insults her husband, Shiva's grief so intense that he carries her corpse across the world in a dance of mourning, her body parts falling to earth and becoming sacred sites, and then her rebirth as Parvati, the daughter of the mountains, who wins Shiva through devoted practice, through tapas, the ascetic heat that generates spiritual power. The Puranas describe Shiva's cosmic dance, the Tandava, performed in the hall with 1,000 pillars, his dance that creates and destroys the universe, his drum marking time, his hand raised in the gesture of fearlessness, his foot crushing the demon of ignorance, the circle of flames surrounding him representing the cycle of birth and death, this image becoming one of the most iconic in the entire tradition. They tell of Ganesha's birth, created by Parvati from the dirt of her own body, set to guard her door while she bathed, beheaded by Shiva, who did not recognize him, and then restored to life with an elephant's head, becoming the remover of obstacles, the lord of beginnings, the patron of writers and merchants, and anyone embarking on new endeavors. They describe the goddess in her many forms as Durga, riding a lion, created from the combined energies of all the gods to defeat the buffalo demon Mahishasura, who could not be killed by any male being, as Kali dancing on battlefields, wearing a garland of skulls, her tongue extended, fierce and terrible, yet also the loving mother who protects her devotees, as Saraswati in white garments, holding the Veena, seated on a lotus or a swan, embodying the flow of knowledge and artistic inspiration. These texts also systematize the practice of puja, the ritual worship that became central to Hindu devotional life, describing how to establish images in temples, how to invoke the deity's presence, how to offer flowers and incense and food, how to perform circumambulation, how to receive prasad, the blessed food that has been offered to and accepted by the god. The temple itself became understood as a cosmic diagram, a three-dimensional mandala, its architecture encoding philosophical and cosmological principles. The central shrine representing the cave of the heart, where the divine dwells, the towering superstructure symbolizing the sacred mountain, the circumambulatory path allowing devotees to honor the deity by walking around the sacred space. And different regions developed their own styles. The Nagara temples of the north with their curving towers, the Dravida temples of the south with their gopurams, gateway towers covered in sculpted figures, rising tier upon tier, entire cities built around temple complexes that became centers of learning and art and economic life. The gods enshrined in these temples were treated as royal persons, awakened in the morning, bathed and dressed, offered meals throughout the day, entertained with music and dance, put to bed at night. The ritualists, understanding that the infinite formless Brahman had graciously consented to dwell in the image, had accepted limitation out of compassion, making the divine accessible to those who needed form and presence. And alongside the grand temples, countless small shrines, roadside stones smeared with vermilion, trees wrapped in sacred thread, every village with its local manifestations of the great gods, its Gramadevata, its protective spirits and ancestors who might be fierce or benign, who required propitiation and respect, who mediated between the cosmic deities and everyday concerns. The philosophical schools also flourished during these centuries. Vedanta, in various forms, interpreting the Upanishads and the Brahma Sutras and the Gita in different ways. Shankara, teaching absolute non-dualism, that only Brahman is real and the world is Maya, appearance, superimposition like the snake mistaken for a rope in dim light. Ramanuja, teaching a qualified non-dualism, that souls and the world are real but dependent on Brahman, like waves are real manifestations of the ocean, not separate, but also not merely illusory. His philosophy supporting devotional practice by affirming the reality of the personal God worthy of love and worship. Madhva teaching dualism, eternal distinction between God and souls, between the Creator and creation, 5 fundamental differences that are never overcome even in liberation. His vision preserving the devotional relationship while granting souls their own intrinsic reality, and the tantric traditions emerging, working with the body as a site of transformation, with kundalini energy rising through the chakras, with mantras and yantras and complex ritual practices, understanding the goddess as Shakti, the dynamic power that activates Shiva's static consciousness, the two eternally joined in the generative tension that produces all manifestation. These centuries saw an explosion of devotional poetry in regional languages, Tamil, Bengali, Marathi, Hindi, the saints singing of their love for Krishna or Rama or Shiva, Mirabai abandoning her royal status to wander as a devotee, Tulsidas retelling the Ramayana in a vernacular that made it accessible to those without Sanskrit, Kabir weaving together Hindu and Muslim imagery in verses that challenged orthodoxy and sectarian division. The gods became companions in this devotional outpouring, Krishna addressed as friend, as child, as lover, Rama revered as the perfect Lord worthy of service. Shiva approached through ecstatic identification, the devotees often describing states of possession, of merger, of love so intense it dissolved the boundaries of self. And as centuries passed into centuries, as empires rose and fell across the subcontinent, as languages evolved and arts flourished, and philosophies debated in temple courtyards and forest hermitages, the gods continued their own evolution, responding to new contexts, new questions, new longings in the hearts of those who called upon them. The medieval period brought waves of political change, sultanates, and then the Mughal Empire establishing Islamic rule over much of the subcontinent, and the Hindu tradition responded not with uniformity, but with its characteristic multiplicity, some communities maintaining practices unchanged, others adapting, still others creating new syntheses that drew from multiple sources. The Bhakti movement intensified during these centuries, spreading across regions, crossing caste boundaries, challenging Brahminical authority through the radical claim that devotion mattered more than birth or learning, that a low-caste leather worker or a woman poet could achieve union with the divine through love alone, without elaborate rituals or scholarly knowledge of Sanskrit texts. The saints of this movement came from every stratum of society. Namdev the tailor, Kabir the weaver, Ravidas the cobbler. Their songs declaring that the divine dwelt not in temples alone, but in the heart of every sincere seeker, that external observances meant nothing without internal transformation, that the same truth could be called Krishna or Allah, Rama or Rahim, names pointing toward a reality beyond all naming. Chaitanya in Bengal danced through the streets in ecstatic devotion to Krishna, creating a movement that emphasized congregational singing, kirtan, the collective raising of voices in praise. His followers developing sophisticated theologies around the relationship between Krishna and the devotee, mapping the stages of love from initial attraction through deepening intimacy toward the ultimate union that preserves distinction even in merger. The Alvars and Nayanars in the Tamil South had pioneered this devotional intensity centuries earlier, singing in the vernacular, visiting temple after temple, their songs collected into sacred canons, the Nalayira Divya Prabandham for the Vaishnavas, the Tevaram for the Shaivas, texts that rivaled the Vedas in devotional authority, that demonstrated the power of love expressed in human languages rather than Sanskrit alone, and the goddess traditions flourished with particular intensity. The Devi Mahatmya, recounting how Durga slew Mahishasura, how Kali emerged from Durga's forehead to destroy demons, how the goddess in her various forms protected the cosmos when the gods themselves proved insufficient. These narratives affirming feminine divine power as supreme, as the source from which even the great male gods derived their efficacy. The Shakta Tantras describe the goddess as the ultimate reality, Shiva without Shakti reduced to a corpse, powerless, inert. Only through union with the feminine principle could consciousness actualize its creative potential. This theological vision supporting goddess worship as the highest path, Devi not as consort, but as the supreme deity herself. Regional forms of the goddess proliferated. Kali worshipped in Bengal with intense devotion, Ramakrishna in the 19th century spending hours in her temple, falling into trances, experiencing visions, teaching that all religions led to the same truth, but choosing to approach that truth through the form of the Divine Mother, his disciple Vivekananda, carrying this message to the West, introducing Hindu philosophy to audiences who had known nothing of it. The colonial period brought new challenges and transformations. British rule, imposing foreign categories on Hindu traditions, administrators attempting to codify laws, to systematize practices, to understand through their own frameworks a tradition that had always resisted singular definition. Hindu intellectuals responded variously, some internalizing colonial critiques, attempting to reform practices seen as backward, opposing child marriage, promoting widow remarriage, questioning caste discrimination, often drawing on ancient texts to argue that contemporary practices had deviated from original purity. Others asserted continuity and value, defending practices as expressions of profound philosophical truths misunderstood by outsiders, arguing that the tradition's diversity and tolerance exceeded anything found in Christianity or Islam. That idol worship reflected sophisticated understanding of the formless manifesting through form. The gods themselves became contested symbols, reformers sometimes arguing for a more abstract monotheism, suggesting that worship of multiple deities represented primitive superstition that educated Hindus should transcend, while traditionalists insisted on the validity of polytheistic practice, on the reality of the gods as distinct personalities worthy of devotion. Gandhi drew on the tradition selectively, using the concept of ahimsa, nonviolence, as a political weapon against colonial rule, reading the Gita as a text about spiritual struggle rather than literal warfare, his interpretation innovative yet presented as recovery of authentic meaning, the text's flexibility allowing for this creative reappropriation. He also elevated the figure of Rama, using the name Ram Raja, Rama's kingdom, to describe the ideal society he hoped independent India would become, though his vision emphasized justice and equality in ways that went beyond traditional interpretations. Rama reimagined as symbol of righteous governance rather than simply royal authority. Independence brought new questions about the relationship between religious tradition and modern nation-state, the secular constitution protecting religious freedom, while many continued to see Indian identity as fundamentally Hindu, the gods invoked in political rhetoric, temples becoming sites where national and religious identities merged and sometimes clashed. The 20th century also saw Hindu traditions spreading beyond the subcontinent through migration and missionary activity, yoga traveling to the West, first in rarefied forms taught by swamis to small groups of seekers, then gradually popularized, adapted, separated from its religious context, and repackaged as wellness practice, as fitness routine, as stress management technique. Meditation practices followed similar trajectories. Transcendental meditation offering mantras stripped of their devotional meanings, mindfulness drawing on Buddhist sources but finding ready adoption among those familiar with Hindu contemplative traditions, the boundaries between traditions blurring in diaspora contexts. The gods themselves acquired new forms and contexts. Krishna and Ganesha appearing on posters in college dorm rooms, their images aestheticized, commodified, divorced from ritual practice, yet still somehow carrying resonance, still pointing towards something seekers found meaningful even when translated into utterly foreign settings. ISKCON, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, established temples around the world, introducing Westerners to ecstatic devotion, to kirtan and prasad, and the philosophy of Chaitanya's lineage, their translation of the Bhagavad Gita spreading widely, becoming for many their first encounter with Hindu texts. Though traditionalists sometimes questioned the movement's innovations and evangelistic approach, Hindu communities in diaspora built temples that became cultural centers, places where immigrant families could maintain connections to tradition, where children could learn languages and stories and practices their parents feared might otherwise be lost. The gods presiding over community gatherings that were simultaneously religious and social, devotional and ethnic, and back in India, the tradition continued its internal debates and developments, new gurus arising, some controversial, some revered, all claiming to offer authentic paths, while often innovating freely, combining traditional elements in novel ways, using modern media to spread their messages, attracting followers who might seek spiritual guidance while remaining skeptical of institutional religion. The gods appeared in new media, in calendar art, in comic books, in television serials that became cultural phenomena, Entire communities gathering to watch episodes of the Ramayana or Mahabharata, the gods' stories told through these modern forms, reaching audiences far larger than any temple ritual or scripture recitation could access. Films explored mythological themes, sometimes reverently, sometimes playfully, sometimes controversially. The gods, as characters in narratives that might affirm tradition or question it, that might present them as literal beings or as psychological symbols. The interpretive possibilities as multiple as the tradition itself, and philosophical explorations continued, scholars and practitioners debating the meaning of ancient texts, producing new commentaries on the Upanishads and Gita, arguing about whether Vedanta pointed toward non-dualism or theism or something that escaped these categories altogether, the tradition's intellectual vitality undiminished by modernity's challenges. The environmental movement found resources in Hindu traditions, ideas of the earth as goddess, of rivers as sacred, of trees as worthy of reverence. These concepts deployed in conservation efforts, used to argue for environmental protection on religious grounds, though critics noted the gap between ideals and practices, between reverence for nature in principle and its exploitation in fact. Feminist scholars grappled with the tradition's complex legacy, finding empowerment in goddess worship, yet also critiquing patriarchal structures, celebrating Sita and Draupadi, yet questioning the constraints imposed on women in their names, recovering forgotten female saints and philosophers, while challenging interpretations that subordinated women, the goddesses themselves becoming sites of contested meaning. And through all these transformations, through colonialism and independence, through diaspora and globalization, through modernization and its discontents, the gods remained, not unchanged, never unchanged, but continuous, recognizable, their stories still told, their names still invoked, their images still venerated in temples, ancient and newly built, in homes and roadside shrines, in the inner sanctums of hearts, still seeking meaning through forms inherited from countless generations. The tradition that had begun with Vedic hymns beside ritual fires had become something vast and varied beyond any simple description, encompassing philosophy and devotion, ritual and meditation, social structures and personal quests. Inclusive of countless local variations and sectarian distinctions, yet somehow also unified by shared stories and symbols and practices. To speak of the gods of Hinduism in the singular was to falsify through oversimplification, yet to catalog every regional form and theological interpretation would be to drown in detail without grasping the patterns, the family resemblances, the themes that recurred across contexts. These were gods who created and destroyed, who descended and withdrew, who demanded sacrifice, yet also granted grace freely, who embodied contradictions without being contradictory, who were one and many simultaneously, who were ultimate reality and also personalities with preferences and moods, who transcended all form yet welcomed worship through images, who had existed forever yet also manifested in historical time. And perhaps this multiplicity, this refusal of singular definition, this comfort with paradox and plurality, was itself the deepest truth the tradition offered. Not a bug, but a feature, not confusion, but sophistication, a recognition that the infinite could not be captured in any single formulation, that the divine necessarily appeared differently to different seekers in different circumstances, That truth itself was too large for uniformity. The gods had journeyed far from those Vedic fire altars, yet they remained connected to them. The hymns still chanted, the rituals still performed, the questions still asked. Continuity and change braided together like the Ganges and Yamuna at their confluence, distinct yet flowing together toward an ocean that contained them both. The deepening quiet of contemplation draws the mind toward patterns, toward the shapes that emerge when stepping back from individual stories, from particular deities, toward the underlying currents that flow through thousands of years of devotion and speculation. There is a quality to these gods that resists the categories often applied to them. To call them merely metaphors feels reductive, as if those who prostrated before their images or sang their names were engaged in some elaborate misunderstanding. Yet to insist on their literal objective existence in the way a mountain exists also misses something essential, some flexibility, some creative interplay between the divine and the devotee that makes the relationship more dynamic than simple realism allows. The tradition itself seems comfortable with this ambiguity, with affirming that the gods are real, while also explaining them as aspects of Brahman, as Maya, as Lala, as play and illusion and manifestation all at once, the philosophical and the devotional held together without requiring resolution into singular truth. Consider the concept of Ista Devata, the chosen deity, the recognition that different practitioners might focus devotion on different gods, not because one is true and others false, but because different personalities resonate with different aspects of the infinite. Some drawn to Shiva's asceticism, others to Krishna's playfulness, still others to the fierce protection of Kali, each valid, each offering a genuine path, the diversity celebrated rather than suppressed. Or consider the narratives themselves, the way stories contradict without anxiety. Ganesha's birth told differently in different texts. The goddess described as Shiva's wife in some contexts and as the supreme power from which he emerges in others, the chronology impossible to reconcile if treated as history, yet perfectly coherent as mythology, as truth expressed through story rather than through chronicle. The gods teach through their contradictions. Shiva, the ascetic, who is also the householder, the destroyer who preserves through destroying, the master of yoga who dances in ecstatic abandon. These are not flaws in the characterization, but invitations to deeper understanding, to recognizing that ultimate reality cannot be confined to comfortable categories, that the divine necessarily exceeds human logic, and the avatars of Vishnu encode a cosmological vision, the progression from fish to tortoise to boar, to man-lion to dwarf to warrior, sometimes read as evolutionary sequence, sometimes as myth cycle, always as demonstration that the divine takes whatever form is needed, that there is no situation so desperate, no crisis so severe that intervention cannot come, even if it comes in unexpected guise. The goddess traditions perhaps probe most deeply into paradox. Kali dancing on Shiva's corpse, yet also the nurturing mother. Durga created by the gods, yet superior to them. Saraswati's gentle wisdom and Kali's fierce destruction understood as aspects of single feminine principle. The tradition refusing to separate the creative and destructive, the beautiful and terrible, insisting they are inseparable, that life feeds on death, that creation requires destruction, that the mother who gives life also takes it away. There is also the question of darshan, the seeing and being seen by the deity. This practice that makes temple worship not about asking favors or performing obligations, but about encountering presence, about standing before the image and allowing oneself to be beheld, to be known, the eyes of the god, meeting the eyes of the devotee in an exchange that is somehow mutual, despite the vast disparity in being and the festivals that punctuate the year. Diwali's lights welcoming Lakshmi, Navaratri's 9 nights honoring the goddess, Holi's colors celebrating Krishna's play, Mahashivaratri's vigil of fasting and meditation, these rhythms connecting communities, marking time not just chronologically, but mythologically, allowing participants to enter sacred time, to reenact cosmic events, to align their lives with divine patterns. The practice of mantra carries its own depths. The repetition of names, of syllables, of entire hymns, the sound itself considered powerful, transformative, the vibration altering consciousness, not through meaning alone, but through resonance, through the physical experience of speaking or hearing sacred speech. Om Namah Shivaya, Hare Krishna, Om Aim Sarasvatyai Namah. Each formula a key opening particular doors, invoking particular presences, and the sacred geography that maps the divine onto landscape, the 7 sacred cities, the 12 Jyotir Lingas, the 51 Shakti Pithas, pilgrimage routes connecting these sites, millions walking for days or weeks to bathe in rivers made holy by mythological events, to climb mountains where gods meditated, to circumambulate temples that mark where the divine touched earth, the land itself sacralized through story, every rock and river potentially the site of ancient events, of ongoing presence. The arts too become vehicles for the divine. Classical dance depicting stories of Krishna and Shiva, each gesture codified, each movement laden with meaning, the dancer not performing about the gods, but embodying them, becoming for the duration of the dance a living icon, music as devotion, ragas as offerings, the boundaries between aesthetic experience and religious practice dissolving, and always the texts, the endless production of commentaries and poems and philosophical treatises, each generation adding to the conversation, interpreting, reinterpreting, finding new meanings in ancient words, the tradition alive because it continues to generate thought, to provoke questions, to demand engagement rather than passive acceptance. Perhaps what distinguishes this pantheon is its refusal of finality, its comfort with ongoing elaboration, with regional variations and sectarian developments that splinter and recombine without destroying underlying unity, the way Hinduism encompasses rather than excludes, how it absorbs local deities into larger frameworks, how it allows for both monotheism and polytheism, both personal God and impersonal absolute, both this worldly engagement and renunciation, the capacity to hold contradictions not as problems to solve, but as truths to honor. The gods remain inexhaustible. After thousands of years, after countless stories and songs and philosophical analyses, they still generate new meanings, still speak to contemporary concerns, still offer forms through which the formless can be approached, still invite the devotion and contemplation and creative engagement that keeps tradition living rather than merely preserved. And so the journey through these divine presences begins to curve back toward stillness, toward the quiet from which it emerged, the stories told, the patterns observed, the questions raised and left hanging in the air like incense, smoke drifting upward. The gods of the Hindu tradition are not artifacts, not relics of a superseded worldview. They are living realities for hundreds of millions, presences invoked daily in temples and homes, in moments of crisis and moments of celebration, their names on the lips of the dying and the newborn, woven so deeply into culture and consciousness that to extract them would be to unravel the entire fabric. Yet they are also more than communal heritage, more than ethnic tradition. They are explorations of the possible relationships between human and divine, between finite and infinite, between the urgency of embodied life and the peace of transcendence. Each god a different question, a different answer, a different path up the mountain that all paths climb. To have spent this time in their presence, to have followed their evolution from Vedic hymns, through epic narratives, through devotional movements, through modern reinterpretations, is to have traced one of humanity's longest continuous conversations, one of our most sustained attempts to give form to the formless, to make the infinite intimate, to bridge the chasm between the mortal and the eternal. The images remain: Vishnu on his serpent, Shiva in meditation, Ganesha with his broken tusk, Durga on her lion, Krishna with his flute, each one a doorway, an invitation, a promise that the divine can be known, not fully, never fully, but genuinely, that grace flows toward those who seek, that presence answers the call of longing. And perhaps in the end, what these gods offer is not solutions, but companionship, not answers, but deepening questions, not escape from the human condition, but sacred interpretation of it. They suffer and love and create and destroy alongside those who worship them. They are both utterly other and strangely familiar, both far beyond and somehow near. The temple bells ring at dusk. The arati flames circle before the images. Voices rise in ancient Sanskrit and contemporary vernaculars. And for a moment, the boundaries thin between past and present, between myth and history, between the world as it is and the world as it might be if the divine truly dwelt within it. The Ganges continues its flow. The mountains stand in their eternal patience. The stories are told again to children who will tell them to their children. And the gods remain, shifting, evolving, responding to new devotions and new doubts, as inexhaustible as the human capacity for wonder, as enduring as the questions that wake us in the darkness and follow us into light. The narratives could continue forever. Each god has 1,000 names, each name a story, each story branching into others, the traditions structured like a fractal, the same patterns repeating at every scale, infinity contained in finite forms, the many and the one engaged in eternal conversation. But there is also value in silence, in allowing the words to slow, to space themselves further apart, to recognize that some truths live in the pauses between statements, in the resonance that lingers after the bell has been struck, in the darkness beyond the circle of firelight, where something immense and ancient breathes with patience that makes human time seem like the flutter of leaves. The gods have been generous, sharing their stories, allowing themselves to be discussed and analyzed and contemplated, but they are not exhausted by this attention. They remain, always more to discover, always depths unplumbed, always new aspects to reveal to those who seek with sincerity and devotion. And so the story finds its end, though not conclusion, because these gods have no conclusion. They continue in temples and hearts, in texts being studied and rituals being performed, in questions being asked by new generations, in the eternal return of seasons and festivals, in the ongoing dialogue between the human and the divine. The mist rises from the river, the shapes within it becoming indistinct, fading back into formlessness, but not disappearing, never disappearing, only withdrawing, waiting, ready to manifest again when called upon, when needed, when devotion creates the space for presence. The journey completes, the circle closes, the telling rests, and in the stillness that follows, perhaps something remains, some residue of wonder, some echo of the infinite, some recognition that these gods, in all their multiplicity and contradiction, point toward a reality that exceeds all naming, all knowing, all telling. And the final words drift away like smoke, like morning mist, like prayers carried on the wind, toward mountains where gods have meditated since before time began, dissolving into silence, into peace, into the vast and gentle darkness where all stories begin, and to which all stories, in the end, return.